Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I drove up the narrow road just after sunset, feeling my chest tighten as I looked at the old house on the hill. The front porch light flickered and the wooden steps creaked under my boots. I remember pausing at the threshold and wondering if I should turn back, but I had already made arrangements and part of me felt drawn to the place. The inside smelled like dust and old furniture polish. The previous owner had left a few chairs, a couch, and some odd pieces of decor on the walls. I didn't mind. I wanted peace and quiet, and an isolated hill seemed perfect for that. I spent the first couple of days unpacking my boxes. I placed my clothes in the bedroom closet upstairs, then arranged my books in a small study area next to a single window. That window looked out onto a large slope that ended in a thick cluster of trees. I tried not to focus on how silent everything felt. There were no neighbors and barely any passing cars. I could only hear my own footsteps and the faint hum of the wind outside. On my first night, I sat in the living room with a single lamp on, reviewing some paperwork. At around midnight, I heard something unusual, like a low murmur in the walls. It sounded like a muffled conversation, but I couldn't catch any individual words. My heart thumped in my chest. I stood up, pressing my ear to the wall. The noise stopped. I moved from one corner of the living room to another, trying to find the source. Nothing. I assumed it was the house settling, or maybe an animal outside. My shoulders were tense, but eventually I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. The next morning, I noticed the large framed painting in the hallway was slightly tilted. I remembered it being straight when I first arrived. I wasn't entirely sure, but it caught my attention anyway. I straightened it and told myself it must have been loose on the nail. I left to buy groceries and some basic cleaning supplies. When I got back, a small table in the foyer was 2 or 3 feet from where it had been before. My stomach felt tight as I checked the floor for scratch marks. I saw a faint line in the dust. It looked like the table had been dragged. I told myself I must have bumped it, although I couldn't remember doing that. I pushed it back into place. That night I tried to sleep early. My bed felt comfortable enough, but around 2 in the morning I woke up to the same muffled voices. This time, they seemed closer. I got up and walked down the upstairs hallway in the dark. My throat felt dry. I heard the voices near the walls again. My heart was pounding hard and my hands were sweaty. I pressed an ear to the wall near the bedroom door. Nothing. It stopped again. I returned to bed, lying awake for at least an hour, listening. The rest of the night stayed quiet, but I couldn't stop thinking about those voices. In the morning, I noticed one of my chairs in the living room was facing the wall. I never put it that way. I found a mirror in the hallway turned backward, as if someone had flipped it. My stomach churned. I checked all the windows and doors to see if there was any sign of forced entry. Everything was locked and secure. I told myself it had to be me. Maybe I was moving things around while distracted or half asleep. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the following days, I got more suspicious. Each night, around the same time, I heard those voices in the walls. They sounded faint, like a distant gathering of people speaking in low tones. I tried to record them on my phone, but every time I hit record, the voices vanished. My nerves were on edge, and I found myself pacing the rooms. During the day, I noticed small changes again. Books out of order, a lamp shifted across the table, a throw rug slightly crumpled in the corner. I didn't see or hear anyone else in the house, yet these changes kept appearing. After about a week, a full moon rose. That night, the voices were louder. I was standing in the living room, the moonlight cutting through the windows, giving everything a pale glow. I heard the murmurs in the corner of the room, so I ran there and pressed my hands against the wall. It felt cold. I could hear the low rumble of words I couldn't understand. My mouth went dry. I backed up, feeling a tremor in my legs. Then I glimpsed a flicker of movement by the stairs. It looked like a shadowy figure. I froze. My heart thudded so hard that my ears rang. I took a few steps forward, but the silhouette disappeared around the corner. I moved slowly up the stairs, my breath shaky. The voices grew softer, but I saw another shadow on the landing. It was shaped like a tall person, but I couldn't make out any features. I felt my skin crawl, and I swallowed hard. When I reached out toward it, it slipped into the darkness of the hallway. My hand was shaking so badly that I could hardly keep it steady in front of me. I followed that shadow into the hall, where I only had a small nightlight plugged into the wall. Nothing was there. The hallway was empty. I felt a rush of cold air against my face, though all the windows were shut. I stayed awake until morning, checking each room, each closet, every corner. I found no one, but I felt this clenching in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I had trouble focusing on anything else. I tried turning on the TV for distraction, but the cable wasn't connected yet, so all I got was static. I moved around the house wanting to rearrange furniture to see if anything would happen while I stood there. But everything stayed quiet during the day, and I just felt silly. Over the next few nights, I kept a flashlight next to me and walked around whenever the voices started. Every time I tried to pinpoint the sound, it vanished. My nerves were shot. I barely slept, and I'd often find myself in the kitchen at 3 a.m. looking out the window at the moonlit trees. I started noticing more silhouettes on the nights leading up to the next full moon. They would appear at the edge of my vision. Sometimes I saw them slipping around corners. Other times I saw them near the windows, but when I turned on the lights, the room was empty. My hands would shake and I felt a knot in my stomach that made it hard to eat. I tried telling myself the house might have some old plumbing or wiring that caused strange noises. Maybe my exhaustion was making me see things, but the furniture kept moving, and I could see the marks in the dust or on the floor, proving that something or someone had dragged a chair or a table. I checked the house's history at the local library, but I found nothing. No mention of curses or legends. It was built decades ago, sold a few times, and then stood empty for about 5 years before I bought it. One evening, I decided to push all the furniture to the center of the living room, making one large cluster. That way I could see if anything moved overnight. I also placed small pieces of tape on the walls where I had heard the voices, just to see if they'd fall off or shift. Around midnight, I sat in the dimly lit room with my back against the wall, listening. The voices began again, faint at first, then slowly got louder. It felt like multiple people whispering at once. My throat went tight. I tried to breathe slowly, but my heart hammered in my chest. I stood up, walked to the center of the room, and shined my flashlight on the furniture. One of the chairs was already an inch away from where I had left it. I watched as it shifted a little more, like an invisible hand was nudging it. I felt a burst of cold sweat on my forehead. I took a step back, shining the light in every corner. Nothing else moved, but the voices kept going. I yelled, "Who's there?" My voice sounded weak and shaky in the empty space. The voices stopped instantly, leaving me with only the sound of my own heartbeat. I rushed to the staircase, thinking maybe I'd catch whoever was doing this, but there was no one. On the landing, I saw a silhouette again. This time it seemed to watch me. My skin prickled and I couldn't move at first. My hands started shaking, and I felt my face getting hot. I gathered enough courage to switch on the hallway light. The silhouette was gone. I ran to the spot where I saw it, but found nothing. The tape on the wall in the hall hadn't moved, and the door to the guest room was still closed. I had no explanation. When morning came, I saw the furniture in the living room was scattered again. A painting in the hallway was flipped upside down. I felt so uneasy that I considered leaving for a few days, maybe staying in a hotel. But a stubborn part of me refused to let this house get the better of me. I spent most of the day cleaning, scrubbing the floors, dusting every surface. I wanted to see if cleaning it up would help me notice any fresh footprints or handprints. I found nothing unusual. By afternoon, I was so exhausted that I dozed off on the couch, only to wake up at nightfall with a jolt. The house was dark, and I felt that same heaviness in the air. I walked through the rooms, turning on every light, but I still felt like someone was watching me. I peeked out the windows at the moonlit yard. Trees swayed in the breeze and the night sky looked clear. Then I heard a sudden thud upstairs. I grabbed my flashlight and took the stairs 2 at a time. My breathing was loud in my ears, and my palms were slick with sweat. I looked around the bedroom, the closet, the bathroom. Nothing. Then I noticed the door to the attic, which I had never explored. It was slightly ajar. I stepped into the attic, shining my flashlight around. Old boxes, dusty furniture, cobwebs. The air felt stale and cold. I moved slowly, feeling the floorboards creak under my weight. I saw a shape near the far corner. My heart pounded, and I raised the flashlight. It was just an old coat draped over a chair. I exhaled and shook my head. But then I heard a whisper right behind me, close to my ear. It sent a chill through my entire body. I spun around, shining the flashlight in all directions. Nothing there. I hurried out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. Back in the hallway, my legs felt weak. I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. The voices started again, their low murmurs spreading through the house. They sounded closer, echoing through the corridors. My hands shook so bad that I almost dropped the flashlight. I managed to make it downstairs. The living room lights flickered. I thought they might go out, so I stood next to the switch in case I needed to flip the breaker. But they stayed on, buzzing slightly. The shadows in the corners seemed to move. I was sure I saw 2 silhouettes near the window. I kept my eyes on them, heart racing, but they vanished. I decided I had reached my limit for that night. I locked myself in the bedroom, turned on every light, and sat on the bed with the covers over my legs, waiting. I felt queasy and shaky, and my mouth was dry. The voices faded sometime around dawn. I cracked open the window to let in some fresh air, then forced myself to drink a glass of water. My body was stiff, and my heart felt like it had been pounding for hours. The next day, I tried to ignore my fear. I checked outside for footprints or any sign that someone was messing with me. I found only my own tracks. I looked around the yard and saw nothing out of the ordinary. The isolation of this place weighed on me. I stood on the porch, staring at the distant road. No cars passed. I felt alone, exposed. I tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe an intruder was hiding somewhere. Maybe I was having a mental breakdown. But I couldn't decide which was worse, an invisible intruder or the possibility that I was losing my mind. As the next full moon approached, I noticed a cycle. The voices got louder, the silhouettes appeared more frequently, and the furniture moved around in ways that defied reason. It was like the house came alive at night. I could feel the walls almost hum with energy. My heart would pound and my mind would race. I started keeping a notebook, jotting down the times I heard the voices, the locations where I saw the silhouettes, and the items that had moved. Despite all this, I had no solid proof. Everything sounded crazy when I read it back to myself. One evening, I sat in the living room, lights on, and stared at the walls. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. The voices started again, low and steady. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and pressed my palm against the nearest wall. The vibration felt faint, but it was there. My heart pounded in my ears. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a dark figure in the doorway. I turned to face it, and it moved deeper into the room. My stomach lurched. I stepped back, and it stopped. I was too terrified to speak. After a few seconds, it drifted toward the hallway, dissolving into the shadows. I couldn't understand how something could appear so solid and then vanish like that. I checked the clock. Midnight. The voices surged again, filling my head with a low, incomprehensible chatter. My pulse raced, and I gritted my teeth, determined not to run. I felt a cold draft wash over me. I looked at the furniture. A small side table slid a few inches across the floor in plain sight. My whole body tensed. A framed photo on that table toppled over. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't move or speak. Eventually, the voices faded, and I was left in the silent house. I realized my shirt was soaked in sweat, and my hands were trembling. I looked around at the scattered furniture, the tilted pictures, the flickering lights. I wondered if this was all in my head or if the house had its own presence that toyed with me at night. I honestly couldn't tell anymore. All I know is that these things keep happening, and I'm here, stuck on this hill, listening to voices in the walls. I still haven't figured out whether I'm dealing with a living house or my own unraveling mind. At this point, I'm not sure which possibility scares me more. I keep thinking about leaving, but something in me refuses to abandon this place just yet. I feel drawn to it, even as I dread the nights. Every time the moon grows fuller, the activity ramps up again. The silhouettes appear in the hallways. The voices ring through the walls and the furniture moves on its own. I never know what I'll face when I turn a corner. But for now, I stay. I listen, and I wait, hoping I'll find some answer in the darkness. I still remember how the stale smell of mold hit me when I stepped into that abandoned building. The boards creaked, and every step felt like it could break through the floor. I had my flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, hoping to record some quick shots of the place for my reference. It was supposed to be a simple exploration mission. I thought I'd find old beams, maybe a few interesting door frames, or some decorative trim that I could salvage for my personal projects. Instead, I found that dusty, grimy window leaning against a broken wall in the back of a large empty room. Its frame was dark, chipped, and covered in spider webs. The glass was cloudy in some spots, but intact. I picked it up out of pure curiosity, wiped a spot with my sleeve, and realized it had a strange thickness to it, almost like it had been made with some old method of glass making. My decision to bring it back to my studio seemed harmless at the time. I want to be very clear about what I saw next. When I lifted that window and held it upright, the outside view behind it didn't match the room. It wasn't a reflection, and it wasn't the rest of the building. It looked like a field at dusk, with pale light across a flat landscape. At first, I thought I was looking at some kind of illusion caused by the dirt on the glass. But I moved the window around, trying different angles, and that same field stayed in view. It was weird, but it looked faint, like a hazy image that hovered just behind the glass. I didn't feel scared at that moment, just confused and a little intrigued. I assumed it was some unusual optical trick from the failing sunlight coming in through a crack in the wall. So I carried the window out of the building and loaded it in the back of my truck. When I got home, I left the window by the door of my small workshop. I have a separate studio room where I keep my drafting table and old architectural models. The workshop is attached to that space by a short hallway. That night, I planned to clean and restore the window. But I was exhausted from the day, and it was already late. So I just leaned it against the wall and went to bed. I didn't notice anything unusual at that time. The next morning, I woke up, ate a quick breakfast, and headed to my workshop. I turned on the overhead light, walked over to the window, and started wiping it with warm water and mild soap. The grime came off in gray streaks. Little by little, more of the glass became clear. Then I noticed something that made me pause. It wasn't just that same field behind the glass, it seemed brighter, like morning light in that other scene. I leaned in closer. I saw a few distant trees in that field. They almost looked real, but slightly dull in color. There were no buildings or roads, just a flat, open expanse. I felt a flutter in my chest, that quick pulse you get when you realize something's off. I put down the rag. I blinked a few times, trying to see if my vision was playing tricks. I tapped the glass. I even touched the backside of the frame. I expected to find some hidden panel or something that could produce an image. But there was nothing. Just old wood, splinters and nails. The front of the glass was cold to the touch, even though my workshop was fairly warm. That didn't make sense. I tried turning the window around to see if the strange view would vanish, but it stayed there, always in the glass, no matter how I placed it. I felt uneasy. I decided to lean it against the far wall and walk away from it for a bit. Maybe I could get some fresh air and return later. But curiosity pulled me back in after just a few minutes. I approached the window again and stared through it. Now I saw a dark figure standing far away in that field. I couldn't see any features, just a shape of a person, tall and still. My stomach tightened, and I stepped back. I told myself it was probably my own reflection playing tricks, but it didn't move the same way I did. And whenever I shifted to the side, the figure remained in the same distant spot. I got up close, trying to see if I could make out details on this figure, but it just stood there like a silhouette against the pale horizon. I decided to leave the workshop for the day. I locked the door behind me and tried to focus on other tasks. I have a few ongoing projects, and I spent most of my afternoon reviewing blueprints in my home office. But I couldn't stop thinking about that window. I didn't know if I should call someone, maybe a friend, to check it out. But I felt embarrassed about how irrational it all sounded. A window showing a different place. It's crazy. I kept telling myself it had to be some complicated reflection or some effect caused by the old glass. That night, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. My hallway light flickered once. I thought maybe the bulb was going out. I replaced it, but it kept flickering. When I walked past the workshop door, I felt a slight chill coming from under the gap. The entire rest of the house felt normal. I decided to take a quick peek. I flipped on the workshop light. The window was still leaning against the wall. The figure was gone, and the field looked darker, more like evening again. I forced myself to ignore it and headed to bed. My sleep was restless, filled with half-awake moments where I imagined that tall figure standing in my room. The next morning, I woke up determined to get rid of that thing, or at least store it somewhere out of sight. I ate breakfast quickly and marched into the workshop with a roll of thick fabric. I planned to wrap the window so I wouldn't have to see that strange field anymore. My plan was simple. Cover it, maybe nail some boards over the glass, and then put it in a storage closet. But as soon as I started draping the fabric over the frame, I felt a heavy sensation in my chest. The air felt colder. My hands shook a little, but I kept at it, pressing the cloth against the glass. Right when the cloth touched the pane, I heard a faint tapping sound. It was soft, like something gently knocking on glass from the other side. I froze. The tapping continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. My throat felt tight. I yanked the cloth away and took a step back. The field was still there, dim and empty. There was no one visible in it. But that tapping felt real. I wrapped the fabric more carefully, trying to ignore the chill on my arms. Once the glass was completely covered, I carried the window to a corner. I slid it into an old wardrobe that I use for storing random junk, and I closed the doors. I stood there for a moment, waiting to hear if anything would happen. Nothing did. I left the workshop and locked it. I tried to calm down by doing some routine tasks around the house. I cleaned the kitchen, organized some tools, and answered a few emails. In the back of my mind, I felt relief that I didn't have to look at that strange window anymore. But my sense of relief didn't last long. In the late afternoon, I went to the bathroom to wash my hands. I leaned over the sink and glanced up at the mirror. At first, I just saw my tired face in the usual background. Then, in the corner of the reflection, I noticed movement behind me. My heart raced. I whipped my head around, but nothing was there. I looked back at the mirror and saw a faint shape, almost the same tall silhouette I had seen in the window. It stood in the hallway behind me, motionless. I backed away from the sink, turned around again, and the hallway was empty. I felt my palms sweating. My breathing was shallow. I could sense my pulse in my neck. The figure in the mirror didn't appear again when I checked the reflection a second time, but I left the bathroom light on and shut the door. I felt like I was going to lose it if I saw that shape again. That evening, I noticed flickers in the windows of my house, like small flashes of light that shouldn't be there. I was scared to look too closely. I tried watching some TV to calm my nerves, but every reflection on the screen's surface made me jump. I started seeing outlines and movement at the edges of my vision. My living room was quiet, but each small sound, like the fridge humming or the clock ticking, seemed louder and more threatening than usual. I knew I couldn't just pretend nothing was wrong. I decided to go back into the workshop, pull the window out and examine it one more time. Maybe destroying it was the only option. I walked in, turned on the light, and approached the wardrobe where I had stored the window. The doors were still closed. I pulled them open, expecting the window to be exactly how I left it. But the cloth was partially pulled off, like someone had tugged it down. Part of the glass was visible. I stared at the dark surface. The field was there, but it was nighttime now in that strange place with a dim glow on the horizon. I noticed several silhouettes spread out across the landscape. Not just one. It looked like 4 or 5 figures standing in different spots. I couldn't see their faces. They just stood there, facing me. My stomach churned. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I felt the sudden urge to slam the wardrobe doors shut. But I also felt compelled to look closer. I forced myself to step forward. My palms were damp. My throat was dry. I told myself I needed to see if these figures were actually moving, or if they were just illusions stuck in place. I leaned in, focusing on one figure that seemed a bit closer to the glass than the others. Right then, I heard that tapping again, this time louder and more insistent. It sounded like someone knocking on a window from the outside, but with more force. I jumped back and nearly tripped over a stool. The tapping stopped for a moment, then started again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the flashlight steady. I muttered something like, "What do you want?" under my breath, even though I didn't expect any answer. There was no voice from the other side, just another round of taps. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a hammer and put it against the glass, ready to smash it. But a shiver ran through me and the hair on my arms stood up. I felt a strong sense that if I broke that glass, something worse might happen. I held the hammer there, my arm tense, but I couldn't follow through. It was like a part of me believed that once the window broke, whatever was behind it could slip out or something along those lines. I know that sounds irrational, but I couldn't dismiss the feeling. So I lowered the hammer, set it aside, and pulled the cloth back over the glass. I slid the wardrobe doors shut, locked them with a small padlock, and staggered back out of the workshop. My head was throbbing. My breathing was fast. I felt a dryness in my mouth and a metallic taste on my tongue. Once I got back into the main part of the house, I checked every reflective surface I could think of. The bathroom mirror was clear. The windows showed my own yard outside. The TV screen reflected just the furniture. I tried to relax, but every slight reflection still made me nervous. I realized I couldn't keep living like this. I decided to call a friend to come over, not to explain everything in detail, but just to have someone around. I made the call, but no one answered. I sent a text. While waiting for a reply, I paced around the kitchen. My friend eventually messaged back that they were busy. I didn't push the issue. I felt silly telling them, "I think I have a haunted window in my workshop." So I spent that night alone, checking the locks, keeping the lights on, and avoiding mirrors. At around midnight, I got up to get a glass of water. I walked by a small decorative mirror in the hallway. I saw something shift in the reflection, but I kept walking. My nerves were shot. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I tried to sleep on the couch, where I could keep an eye on the hallway. I dozed off at some point, but every small noise stirred me awake. At one point, I heard the distinct sound of glass rattling. It was distant, like it came from the workshop. My pulse sped up, but I convinced myself I was half dreaming. I didn't get up to check, and the sound eventually stopped. In the morning, I mustered the courage to head straight to the workshop. I opened the door and saw the wardrobe still locked. I didn't hear any tapping this time. The air felt less tense. I unlocked the doors, trying to confirm that the cloth was still in place. It was. I moved it aside just enough to peek through the glass. The field was dimly lit, maybe dawn in that strange place. I saw one figure standing closer than before. I swear I could make out a dark outline of shoulders and a head facing me. I felt a spike of panic. I left the cloth on and closed the wardrobe doors. I realized I couldn't stay in the same building as that thing anymore. I needed a plan to remove it entirely. But I couldn't just dump it in a trash heap and walk away. Something in me was terrified of letting it out into the world. At the same time, I couldn't keep it here. I decided to board up the wardrobe, hammering planks across the front so it wouldn't open easily. Then I left the workshop. The boards don't look good, and it's not a permanent solution. but it's the best I can do right now. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself by cleaning up the yard and organizing my garage. Every time I glanced toward the workshop door, I felt a rush of cold dread in my stomach. I'm still in that situation. I haven't seen any more silhouettes in my mirrors or windows since I locked and boarded the wardrobe. The rest of the house has been quiet, with no flickers or strange reflections. But I don't feel safe. I keep expecting to hear knocking or see movement out of the corner of my eye. My plan is to haul that window out to some remote location and leave it there. I don't know if that will solve the problem, but I can't live with it here. I'm still working up the nerve to do it. Sometimes I wonder if those shapes behind the glass are actually people, or maybe there's something else just appearing as people to mess with me. I don't know. I'm not even sure I want to know. For now, all I can do is keep the window locked away, avoid any reflections that make me uneasy, and hope that these figures stay behind the glass. I didn't sign up for any of this. I just wanted a decorative piece for my studio. I never expected to bring home a window that shows a world with silent watchers who seem too aware of my presence. My heart still races when I hear the faintest tapping sound. I can't even be sure if I'm imagining it sometimes or if it's really coming from inside that wardrobe. I just want this to end. I want my home to feel like my own space again. I'm going to decide on a day soon, when I have the courage, to take that window far away and leave it there, still covered, still hidden, and hope that the watchers don't follow me back. Until then, I'll keep my doors locked, my curtains drawn, and my eyes down when I pass by mirrors. I've learned my lesson. Some things are better left undiscovered, and I'm pretty sure this window is one of them. Last week I decided to remodel the basement because the floorboards were rotting around the edges, and the walls had started to show a few cracks. I didn't want to leave any loose ends or hidden damage. I had no idea that a simple weekend project would turn into something that keeps me awake at night. I want to tell this story as straight as possible because I don't want to lose myself in fancy words. I'm not sure who will believe me, but I need to get it off my chest. Every single thing I'm about to say happened exactly as I remember. I started that weekend early on Saturday. I carried a large crowbar, a flashlight, and a box of tools down the basement stairs. The light above the stairs was weak, so I had to rely on my flashlight. The air smelled damp like old laundry. I remember kicking aside some mildewed cardboard boxes and an old chair with a broken leg. At first, I thought everything would go smoothly. I planned to remove the old floorboards, check the beams, and then lay down new plywood. Simple stuff. By mid-afternoon, I had pried up most of the boards near the center of the basement. Then I spotted something wedged in a small gap between two beams. It looked like a book, maybe an old ledger or something. Dust covered the spine. I pulled it out carefully so I wouldn't damage it. It was a small diary with a worn cloth cover and a rusted metal clasp. The clasp was already broken, so I flipped it open right away. It didn't look like any diary I'd ever seen. There were no dates in the margins. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes rushed and sometimes neat. The pages had dark smudges that I assumed were old water stains. At first, I scanned a few lines and couldn't make sense of it. Then I found a part that described someone walking down the basement stairs and disappearing. The entry was straightforward, like a list of details. He came down with a lantern and the light flickered. Then he wasn't there anymore. I felt a sudden chill in my arms. I held the diary closer to my face and read more. The next entries described more people disappearing. Different days, different details, but always the same basement. No mention of where they went, just that they vanished. There was no mention of blood, no mention of bodies, just empty space where someone used to be. I remember thinking it must be some kind of strange fiction. I set the diary aside and went back to prying up the floor. I told myself I was being stupid for taking it seriously. But after a while, I realized I was listening for something. The basement was too quiet, except for my own breathing and the occasional creak from the house settling. I turned off my flashlight for a second just to see how dark it would be. It was pitch black. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. I turned the flashlight back on right away because something about that darkness made my chest feel tight. I wrapped up around dinner time, carried my tools upstairs, and left the floor half finished. I set the diary on the kitchen counter. While I heated up some leftovers, I flipped through more pages. The entries never named the writer. They never gave a year or even a hint about the time period, but the entries kept mentioning the basement. They always talked about hearing something faint, a voice or a whisper that seemed to come from underneath. People would go down to investigate, and then they'd be gone. The writer sounded desperate. They wrote about telling neighbors, telling friends, but no one believed them. Then the entries stopped without any explanation. The last line read, "I hear my name, but I won't go down." That night I slept uneasily. I didn't dream about anything specific, but I kept tossing around, and I'd wake up suddenly, thinking I heard footsteps above me. I'd sit up, look around, and see nothing but the dim outline of my bedroom furniture. By morning, I brushed it off as my own nerves. I told myself the diary was just a creepy story. I had a lot of work to do downstairs, so I pushed away my doubts. On Sunday, I went back down to the basement with fresh energy. I tore out more boards, replaced a few beams, and started to measure for new plywood. Around noon, I took a break and gulped down a bottle of water. That's when I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was wind or maybe the pipes. I stood there, not moving, and listened. It was a low whisper. I couldn't make out words, but it had a definite rhythm, like someone repeating the same phrase. My pulse sped up. I walked around, shining my flashlight into each corner. The place was empty. The walls were bare. The sound stopped. I told myself it had to be the house settling or a draft. But my hands felt shaky. I forced myself to keep working. By late afternoon, I had the new plywood in place. The basement looked cleaner and safer. I tried to forget about the whispering, but it stayed in the back of my mind. When I finally went back upstairs, I felt relieved. I closed the basement door behind me with more force than necessary and locked it. Then I went to the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But about an hour later, I heard a soft, scraping sound. It seemed to come from the hallway. I muted the TV and listened. Nothing. I walked over to the basement door. It was open by a couple of inches. I know I locked that door. I remember the click of the lock. I felt a quick rush of panic. My heart pounded. I checked the deadbolt. It was still in the locked position, but the door had swung open anyway. I closed it again, turned the lock a few times to be sure, and stood there for a while. My mouth felt dry. Eventually, I stepped back and tried to calm down. I told myself maybe the lock was old. Maybe it wasn't lining up properly. I tested it a few more times. It seemed fine. I double-checked all my windows, all my outside doors, just to be safe. That night, I went to bed with an uneasy feeling in my gut. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up from a dream. My heart was racing. The dream was gone from my memory, but I felt sweaty and disoriented. I switched on my lamp. Then I heard it, a quiet voice calling my name from somewhere downstairs. It was very faint, but it sounded so clear, like somebody standing at the bottom of the stairs. My whole body tensed. My mind started racing with all the possible explanations: an intruder, a prank, or maybe I'd just gone nuts. I got up, grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, and crept into the hallway. I flicked on every light switch I could find. I reached the top of the basement stairs and looked down. It was dark. Nothing moved. I opened the door slowly, one step at a time, shining a flashlight into every corner. The basement was empty. I didn't sleep well after that. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore what happened. I went to work. I went through my regular routine, but each night I'd get home and check the basement. The door was always secure when I first looked at it. I'd go about my evening, make some dinner, watch a little TV, take a shower. Then, out of nowhere, I'd feel this heaviness in the air. I'd check the door, and it would be open again. There was never any sign of forced entry, and I couldn't see a reason for it. It just kept happening. I stopped leaving the diary in the kitchen. I put it in a box in my closet, hoping maybe that would help me forget it. But it didn't change anything. One evening, I decided to seal the basement for good. I bought heavy-duty boards and nails. I blocked off the entire doorway. I hammered until my arms were sore. I tested it, pushed on it with all my strength, and it held firm. There was no way to open that door from either side without some serious effort. I felt a surge of relief. I told myself it was over. If the door couldn't open, the basement couldn't bother me. That night, I slept harder than I had in days. I woke up the next morning feeling a small wave of hope. But when I went to the hallway, I saw that the boards had been pried loose, and the door was open. The boards lay on the floor, nails bent and scattered. My stomach lurched. I stood there for a long moment, not moving, listening to my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I felt a cold sensation across my shoulders, like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but I saw no one. I had no idea how to explain it. I didn't see scratches or any sign of a tool. The boards were just torn off as if they'd been peeled away. I stayed home from work that day. I kept every light on in the house. I walked from room to room, checking closets, cabinets, under beds. I didn't find anything unusual except for that damn door. It stayed open no matter how many times I closed it. By evening, I was mentally exhausted. I tried calling a friend, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening without sounding crazy. I just said I was having a rough time and couldn't sleep. We talked about random things for a while, and I felt a bit better. When night fell, I thought about sleeping in my car. But I stayed inside, locked myself in my bedroom, and propped a chair under the doorknob. I left the lights on. My plan was to keep an eye on the hallway. Maybe I'd catch whoever was messing with me. But around midnight, I dozed off. I woke up a few hours later, right as I heard that whisper again. It said my name in a slow, drawn-out way. My skin crawled. I realized my bedroom door was wide open, and the chair I'd wedged under the knob was pushed aside. I froze in place, breathing in short gasps. My mouth was dry, and I noticed sweat on my forehead. I forced myself to get out of bed. I was shaking all over. I walked into the hallway, flicked the light switch, and saw that the basement door was open. The boards I had used earlier were in a pile again. I could barely think. My heartbeat felt too strong for my chest. All I could focus on was the door, standing there like a black hole. The next thing I did was something I never thought I'd do. I went outside, grabbed some concrete mix, and decided to seal the basement entrance from the hallway side. I spent hours that morning mixing and pouring. I didn't care if it ruined the floor. I just wanted that entrance gone. By the time the sun came up, the doorway was encased in a solid layer of concrete. My entire body ached. My hands were numb, and my back felt stiff. But I felt a shred of relief. I told myself I'd never set foot in that basement again. I planned to hire someone else to take care of it later. I just wanted to block it off and forget. I made some coffee, let out a long sigh, and tried to calm my nerves. When I walked back down the hallway, though, I saw a deep crack across the new concrete. It stretched from one edge to the other, forming a crooked line. I stood there, my eyes fixed on that crack, waiting to see if it would widen right in front of me. It stayed where it was, but I felt no relief. It looked like the thing underneath was already working its way through. The next few days were a blur. I spent a lot of time in the living room, dozing off on the couch with the TV on. I didn't bother checking the hallway anymore. I knew what I'd find if I looked. Every time I passed by that spot, the crack seemed to be a bit larger. I tried to pretend it wasn't happening. I tried to do normal things. I'd go to the grocery store, mow the lawn, talk to neighbors about regular stuff. But whenever I came back inside, I'd feel that chill. The air around the hallway felt stagnant, like a place that hadn't been opened in years. Then I'd see the crack, maybe a little longer or a little wider. At night, I kept hearing that voice. It wasn't loud, but it was so clear. I tried wearing headphones. I tried leaving the TV on all night. But I'd still catch it somewhere in the background, a soft whisper dragging my name out. It didn't threaten me. It just kept calling. I started dreaming about the diary. In my dreams, I'd see the words on the page describing people vanishing. I'd see the lines jump around, repeating the same phrases. He was here, then gone. She was here, then gone. I hear my name, but I won't go down. One morning, I woke up drenched in sweat. My neck felt tense. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I sat up on the couch and stared at the hallway. The door, or what used to be the door, stood there with its concrete barrier cracked wide open. A chunk of concrete had fallen away, revealing a gap. It looked big enough to crawl through. My stomach tightened. I had no idea how that was possible. It made me lightheaded. I got up, but my legs felt weak. I approached it slowly. Cold air drifted out. It smelled stale and damp, like the basement used to smell, only stronger. I stood there, struggling to breathe. I didn't want to go near it, but I felt drawn to it at the same time. My name echoed softly from inside the gap. I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. My throat was dry and my palms were sweaty. I inched closer. I could see a faint shape beyond the opening, maybe just the walls or the new boards I installed. Then the whisper got louder, right in my ear, even though no one stood beside me. I stepped back. I ran to the bedroom, grabbed the diary from the closet and flipped through it looking for some clue. I wanted a page that said how to stop this, how to make it go away. But there was nothing. Only those stories of people who had walked down the stairs and never came back. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the book. I looked at the final line again. I hear my name, but I won't go down. The next page was blank, like the writer just stopped. I left the house that day. I got in my car and drove around for a while. I ended up at a diner on the edge of town, drinking coffee until the sun went down again. I didn't know where else to go. I felt silly, but I was terrified to go home. I stayed out late, then drove back, hoping I'd find everything normal. It wasn't. The gap in the concrete was bigger. The door behind it was open, and the basement stairs were visible in the dim light from the hallway. The smell of wet earth hung in the air. I tried to close it off with a tarp and some duct tape, but the tarp kept pulling away as if from an unseen draft. Now I hear my name every night, and I see the open door every morning. I push it shut, or block it, or seal it, but it doesn't matter. It opens again. The whisper follows me from room to room, low and constant, dragging out each letter of my name until my hair stands on end. I don't know what it wants. I don't even know if there's anything physical down there. I just know that something is calling me, and no matter what I do, it won't stop. I'm writing this because I hope someone else might have an explanation. The diary warned about this. It said people disappeared. I haven't gone down those stairs since I finished the remodeling, and I won't. But I'm scared that one night I'll wake up and find myself standing at the threshold, not by choice. I'm scared that one day I'll give in to that voice because it won't leave me alone. I've run out of ways to block it. I've run out of excuses to pretend it's not there. I can only stay awake for so long. When I close my eyes, I see the shape of the basement doorway standing open, and I feel my body tense up. My only plan now is to stay out of the house as much as I can, but even when I'm gone, I imagine I hear the whisper in the back of my mind. It's always calling, always there, and I can't outrun it. I don't think anyone can. I pulled onto the highway that night feeling the rain slam against my windshield. My wipers made short, jerky movements. The road was empty, and I could barely see beyond a few yards. Every time I passed a mile marker, I checked the radio just to have some background noise. Most stations were just static, and I felt my grip tighten on the wheel. I was an hour behind schedule, and I wanted to get home. The storm showed no signs of calming down. Water kept spraying up from the tires, and the wind made my car swerve a bit. I turned the dial, hoping to find anything that would keep me awake. That was when I caught a faint voice. It sounded like someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. My eyes flicked to the radio. I turned it up. The voice came in clearer for a second, then faded to static. I thought I heard someone say, "Help," but it sounded garbled. I glanced around the empty highway and only saw dark pavement. I leaned forward trying to catch the voice again. Then it returned, clearer. "Please help. Stuck. Need help." I felt my stomach tighten. I drove a little slower, scanning the side of the road. I cracked my window. Rain blew in, soaking my arm. The voice repeated a few words. "Stuck. Can't get out. Need help." I checked my side mirrors and braked. I pulled onto the shoulder and let my hazard lights flicker. My headlights cut through the rain, showing only the guardrail and some bushes that were bending under the wind. I listened, waiting. The voice kept breaking in and out of static. I wondered if there had been a wreck or someone had run off the road. I turned off the engine. The radio kept transmitting that voice, which was strange. Usually, when I killed the power, the radio went dead, but it stayed on, a dull glow in the dash. The voice said, "I'm here. I'm right here." It sounded close, like the person was just outside the car door. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the storm. Rain pelted my head and shoulders. My jacket wasn't thick enough to keep out the cold, so I hunched forward and walked around the car. I pointed the flashlight toward the guardrail and the ditch on the other side. I didn't see any broken-down vehicle or any sign of someone waving for help. The air smelled of wet asphalt and mud. Thunder rumbled overhead and lightning lit up the sky for an instant. I squinted, trying to see if anyone was there. Nothing, just bushes and puddles. I shouted, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The wind swallowed my words. I waited, shining my flashlight around the area. No movement, no shapes. I walked a few steps down the shoulder, but the mud got thick and I felt my shoes sinking. I stood still for a moment, listening. I heard the rain, the wind, and my own breathing. There was no other sound. Yet I still felt watched, like there were eyes on me. My neck prickled and I turned around quickly, sweeping the light. There was nothing. I rushed back to my car. When I got inside, I slammed the door and locked it. My seat was wet from my clothes and I felt water drip down my temples. My heart was racing. I breathed heavily, trying to calm down. The radio wasn't making any noise now. It was just silent. I tried the engine. It fired up like normal and the radio turned back to static. I fiddled with the dial for a second, but the voice didn't return. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone in the back seat. But it was empty. I pulled back onto the highway, driving slowly. I couldn't stop wondering if I'd imagined that voice. Maybe the storm had made me hear strange signals, but I was sure I heard someone asking for help. That stuck with me all the way home. Over the next few days, I tried to brush it off. I went to work, handled my normal routines, and avoided talking about the incident. Every time I got in my car, though, I felt uneasy. I would glance at the radio, half expecting it to turn on by itself and start talking. But nothing happened. It stayed silent, just normal static when I tried the same station. I told myself it was a one-time thing. Then, on Thursday morning, while I was sitting at a red light, the radio crackled. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned the volume up. That same voice said, "Why didn't you help? You heard me." I froze. Cars behind me honked because the light had turned green, but my foot stayed on the brake. The voice repeated, "You heard me." It was calm, not frantic like before. Finally, I snapped out of it and hit the gas, nearly running the yellow. My hands shook on the wheel. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. At work, I couldn't focus. I kept hearing that voice in my head. By the time I drove home, I was paranoid. The radio stayed off, but I checked it every few minutes. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for my phone or any device to start speaking. My bedroom was quiet, but I felt like something else was there. I got up, checked my closets, and opened the front door to look outside. The street was empty, no sign of anything unusual. Still, I locked every window and door before going back to bed. The following day, I decided to leave the radio off in the car. I had to get groceries. I made sure the dial was set to a clear station. I drove with the windows cracked, hoping the fresh air would calm me. Halfway to the store, I heard static even though the radio was off. It was faint, like a whisper. I looked at the display. It wasn't lit. The static grew louder, and then I heard the voice. "You can't ignore me." I slammed my fist on the dash. I felt my heart pounding, and I pulled into the nearest parking lot. I turned the car off and sat in silence. Nothing. My phone didn't make any noise. The radio was off, but my ears still rang with those words. I felt like I was losing it. When I got home, I dropped the groceries on the table and ran straight to my bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face. I stared at my reflection, trying to steady my breathing. My hands trembled. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest. My shirt felt damp with sweat. Then I heard something from the living room. It was that same static. I froze. The bathroom door was open, and I could see a faint glow coming from my living room TV. I hadn't turned it on. I walked slowly toward it, my stomach twisting. The TV was on a blank channel, just white noise on the screen. Then the voice crackled. "I know who you are. I know what you did." My knees felt weak. I grabbed the back of a chair to keep myself upright. I pressed the power button on the TV. It turned off, but the voice kept going for a second before fading away. That night, I couldn't eat. My appetite was gone. I sat on my couch, phone in hand, thinking about calling someone. But what would I say? That my radio and TV were talking to me in a voice that wanted help? No one would believe me. I decided to ignore it and focus on something else. I tried to watch a normal program, but the static noise kept popping into my head, repeating that line, "I know who you are." By Saturday, I could barely think about anything else. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. I heard rustling sounds near my windows. My phone's speaker hissed sometimes, even when I wasn't playing anything. That afternoon, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard a crackling sound behind me. I whipped around and my phone screen lit up by itself. A notification popped up, but it vanished so quickly I couldn't read it. Then the voice came through the phone's speaker, sounding closer than ever. It whispered details about my past. It said things I'd never told anyone. My stomach churned. I dropped the plate in the sink and it clattered around. My breath caught in my throat. I ran to the bedroom and slammed the door. I grabbed my phone and tried turning it off. The screen went black, but I still heard faint static. I threw the phone on the bed and it slid off, landing on the floor. I sat there for a minute, pressing my palms to my ears. My body was shaky, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I focused on breathing, in and out. Eventually, the static faded. The room felt hot. Sweat dripped down my neck. That evening, I decided to leave the house for a while. I just needed to walk and clear my head. I stepped outside. The sun was low and the air was humid. I walked around my block trying to pay attention to the world around me. I watched the few cars that passed and listened to the hum of air conditioners. I inhaled the smell of wet grass from the storm earlier in the week. For a while, I felt calmer. Then I noticed a flicker in the streetlight above me. It wasn't even fully dark yet, but the light flickered a few times. I stopped and stared at it. That weird sense of being watched crept back in. I forced myself to keep walking, ignoring the goosebumps that rose on my arms. I returned home just before dark. I checked every lamp, every electronic device, and decided to unplug most of them. I sat on my couch with only a small lamp in the corner. My phone was off and in a drawer. I stared at the walls, listening to the hum of my refrigerator. Hours passed, and I eventually fell asleep there in my clothes. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of static again. It was coming from behind me. I turned around, heart pounding. My old radio clock in the kitchen was glowing, even though I'd unplugged it. I stood up, knees trembling, and took a step toward it. The static grew louder. Then the voice said my name. It was calm, almost casual. It said, "You can't run from me." I grabbed the clock and yanked the cord from the wall, but it kept running for a few seconds. Finally, it went dead in my hands. I felt a chill spread through my whole body. I spent the rest of the night with my back to the wall staring at the radio clock. I didn't dare close my eyes. When morning arrived, I felt dizzy and exhausted. I needed answers, but I had no idea where to look. I cleaned up, got dressed, and left the house. I didn't plan where I was going, I just drove trying to distract myself. I ended up on a country road near the spot where I first heard that voice. It was cloudy, but not raining. The road was quiet. I pulled over and got out. I walked to the guardrail and looked down at the ditch. The mud was dried up. I saw footprints, maybe mine from that night, but no sign of anything else. I stood there, waiting to feel something or see something. There was a slight breeze that ruffled my hair. I felt a tightness in my chest again, but I tried to steady my breathing. Then I heard it. A crackling sound from my car. My windows were down, and I could tell the radio had turned itself on. The voice was calling to me, but I couldn't make out the words. I walked back, my legs feeling heavy. The voice sounded faint and distorted. As I got closer, I heard it say, "It's not over." I leaned into the driver's seat and switched the radio off. It refused to shut up at first. The static growled. My finger pressed the button over and over. Finally, the sound stopped. I stood there, heart beating fast. I realized I couldn't fix this by checking cables or ignoring it. This thing, whatever it was, had latched onto me. It knew things about me that no one else knew. It spoke my name, and it followed me outside the car and into my home. I grabbed the steering wheel and closed my eyes for a second. My mind raced with the memory of that night. I remembered standing in the storm, shouting into the darkness, thinking I was doing the right thing. Maybe I had missed something, but there was no sign of another person that night. I saw no broken down car, no crash, nothing. Now I had this presence that wouldn't leave me alone. I felt a surge of anger in my chest. My hands shook, but I tried to stay in control. I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door. I stared at the radio. It was dark and silent now. I clenched my jaw and turned the key. The engine started with a low rumble. On the drive home, I stayed alert. I kept waiting for static. I kept checking my mirrors, worried I might see a shape in the back seat. Nothing happened. When I got home, the house felt normal. No lights were flickering, no strange noises. My phone stayed off. I placed it on the kitchen counter, but it didn't light up or hiss. That night I sat in silence again. I listened to my breathing and the occasional creak of the house. My eyes were heavy and my nerves were frayed. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stand up and walk to my bed. I lay down, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, my eyes closed. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up. There was no voice, no static. The house was quiet. I felt a small sense of relief, but my heart was still pounding. I sat up, rubbed my face, and noticed my hands weren't shaking as much. I got up, went to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. I expected some sign that the presence was still there, but nothing happened. Still, I know it's not gone. I feel it sometimes, like an itch in the back of my mind. I catch a flicker of static on my TV screen or a crackle in the car speakers. I'm on edge, waiting for that voice to slip through again. I haven't told anyone, and I'm not sure I ever will. It knows things about me that I'd rather keep hidden, and it's not afraid to use that knowledge. For now, I live with it. I keep my phone off more often. I unplug my devices at night. I drive with the radio silent. If it wants to speak, it'll find a way. And when it does, I'll be waiting, trying to hold on to whatever courage I have left. I can't see it, but I feel it. I don't know how long I can stand this, but I have no choice. The voice found me on a lonely highway, and it's been with me ever since. I can't escape it. I can only hope it goes quiet, but it never stays quiet for long. I still remember the day I found that mirror. It was a Saturday afternoon and I was walking through this rundown flea market on the outskirts of town. The air smelled like old furniture and dust. My shirt stuck to my back because it was so hot, and I just wanted to get home. But then I saw the mirror leaning against a table full of cracked vases and rusty doorknobs. It had a wooden frame with thin carvings around the edges, kind of scratched up and faded. I wasn't looking for a mirror, but I felt like it stood out. The seller said he'd give it to me for almost nothing. I shrugged and agreed. I figured I could hang it in my bedroom or maybe fix it up if I felt ambitious. I didn't think too hard about it at the time. I just paid the man and hauled it to my car. I got home and carried the mirror inside. It was heavier than it looked. I put it in my bedroom right on top of an old dresser near the closet. I noticed that the glass had tiny dark spots around the edges as if the silver backing was worn. The frame had scratches, but nothing too bad. It was just an old mirror. I didn't think about it much. I spent the rest of the day doing chores, paying bills, and flipping through TV channels. By midnight, I was half asleep on my couch. I dragged myself to bed, closed my blinds, and collapsed face down on the mattress. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up with this strange feeling. I couldn't pinpoint it, but I felt uneasy. My room was silent. The fan on my ceiling rattled a little, but that was normal. When I opened my eyes, I saw a dim glow coming from near the dresser. The blinds were shut, so it wasn't moonlight. It took me a second to realize the glow was coming from the mirror. It wasn't bright, but I could see the faint outline of the frame and the glass. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the sleep, and I told myself it was just some reflection from a streetlight outside. I turned over and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I didn't notice anything off. The mirror looked normal in daylight. I got dressed and went to work. I left the house without a second thought. That evening, I came back, made a frozen dinner, and watched TV. Nothing unusual happened until I went to bed. Once again, I woke up in the dark. This time my eyes flew open because I heard a thump, like something fell over. I sat up fast and looked around my room. Nothing was on the floor. My lamp was still on the nightstand. My shoes were where I'd left them. But the mirror looked different. The reflection showed an extra chair by my closet, a small wooden chair I didn't own. In real life, there was just empty space. I stared at the spot in the room where the chair appeared in the reflection. There was nothing there. I shifted my gaze back to the mirror, and that old wooden chair was right there, clear as day in the reflection. My mouth went dry. My scalp tingled. I squinted, rubbing my eyes, but the chair stayed in the mirror's reflection. I turned on the overhead light. The mirror's reflection then showed only what was actually there. The chair was gone. I stood there in my pajamas, heart pounding, trying to figure out what I'd seen. I looked behind the mirror, under the dresser, in the closet. There was nothing. I reminded myself I was tired. Maybe it was a half-dream. I turned off the light again and the mirror was just dark. No extra furniture. I felt silly for letting it get to me. I got back under the covers, flipped onto my side, and eventually drifted off. The next night I braced myself before going to sleep. I shut the door to my bedroom and made sure the windows were locked. I stared at the mirror a few times, checking if it did anything weird. It just reflected the room like any normal mirror. I flipped off the light, got into bed, and tried to relax. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up shivering. The room felt colder than usual. My arms had goosebumps, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. I looked at the mirror. The reflection showed a door on the wall opposite my bed. That wall has no door in real life. It's just a solid wall. But in the mirror, it looked like a narrow door with old hinges and a rusted handle. The handle was turning like someone was trying to open it. My stomach lurched. I turned on the lamp by my bed, and the door vanished from the mirror. There was only the normal reflection of the wall with my poster and a tall bookshelf. I sat up, breathing fast. I felt sweat breaking out under my arms. I got out of bed and walked across the room to touch the wall. It was solid drywall. No hidden door, no handle. The mirror's reflection had gone back to normal under the lamplight. I couldn't sleep after that. I just sat in bed staring at the mirror. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake again, convinced I heard faint knocking or some kind of scraping sound. By dawn, my eyes burned and my body felt shaky. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the mirror off the dresser and dragged it to the garage. I put it in a corner behind a stack of old boxes. I felt better once it was out of my room. Over the next few days, I slept fine. I didn't see or hear anything strange. On Saturday morning, I resolved to get rid of the mirror. I put it in my trunk and drove to a junkyard about 20 minutes away. I parked my car and wrestled the mirror out of the trunk. The guy there didn't ask questions. He just pointed me to a spot where I could leave my things. I walked away without looking back. My shoulders felt lighter. I felt a bit silly for letting an old mirror scare me. That night, I watched a late movie. I turned off the TV, wandered to the bedroom, and flipped on the light. My chest tightened. The mirror was there, leaning against the wall. The same scratches. The same dull reflection. My heart thudded hard. I knew I'd left it at the junkyard. I walked up to it and touched the frame. It felt cold. My arms started shaking. I didn't bother to check if it was the same serial number or anything like that. I just knew. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe I'd picked up a different mirror by mistake. But that made no sense. I wasn't going to lie to myself. This was the same mirror. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, but it went to voicemail. I didn't know what I would have said anyway. Telling someone that a mirror had come back on its own sounded insane. I stood in the hallway, staring at it, my pulse hammering. Finally, I decided to throw it out again. I picked it up and carried it out of my house. My arms shook with strain, but I forced myself to keep walking until I reached the dumpster behind my building. I wedged the mirror inside, under some broken chairs and plastic bags. Then I went back to my apartment, locked the door, and double-checked all the windows. The next morning, the mirror was in my living room. It stood upright near the couch. I froze in the doorway, groceries in my hands. I almost dropped them. My breathing came in short gasps. I felt lightheaded. I put the groceries on the floor, walked up to the mirror, and stared at my reflection. My eyes looked bloodshot. The reflection behind me showed a hooded figure standing in the far corner, next to the TV stand. I spun around, fists clenched. No one was there. I checked every corner of the living room. I opened the coat closet. Nothing. I looked at the mirror again. The hooded figure wasn't there anymore. I felt a wave of nausea. My throat felt tight. I knew I had to try something else. I wrestled the mirror out of my apartment, loaded it in my trunk, and drove to the edge of town. There's an old parking lot near a condemned warehouse where people dump broken appliances and scrap. I left the mirror leaning against a crumbling wall. Then I sped off without looking back. That night I came home and didn't see the mirror in my apartment. I let out a long breath. I actually managed to sleep a few hours, but around 3 in the morning I woke up to a hard rapping sound. It sounded like someone was banging on glass. My whole body tensed. The banging came again, louder. I forced myself out of bed, shaking. I walked into the hallway. The sound echoed from the living room. I flipped on the light and there it was, the mirror on the floor, angled so it faced my bedroom door. I wanted to scream. My jaw trembled. I forced myself to walk toward it. My reflection looked small and pale. Behind me, inside the mirror, I saw that hooded figure again. It stood across the room near the window. I turned around fast. Nothing was there. I wanted to smash the mirror, but I felt a jolt of fear at the idea. Something in me said that might make things worse. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. My eyes flicked around the apartment. I grabbed a sheet from the bedroom and threw it over the mirror. Then I taped it down around the edges so I couldn't see the glass at all. After that, I tried to settle back into bed. My mind raced with panicked thoughts. I kept hearing the tapping on glass, but I told myself it was just my imagination. The next day, I found the mirror still covered, no new noises. I let myself hope I'd solved the problem. That night, I sat in my living room watching TV, pretending everything was fine. I heard a small ripping sound. I looked over. The corner of the sheet was lifting up on its own, exposing part of the mirror. I felt blood rushing in my ears. I saw my reflection in that small, exposed area. Then I caught a glimpse of something behind me. I turned around. The hooded figure wasn't in the room, but in the mirror it stood right behind my couch. I stood up so fast I nearly fell. I didn't see anything when I looked at the actual space behind the couch. But in the mirror it was there, hood pulled low over its face, arms by its sides, standing motionless. My limbs shook. I took a few steps backward until my heels hit the wall. My breath came out in short bursts. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the friend I'd tried before, but no one answered. I left a frantic message telling him to come over. I paced around the room, avoiding the mirror. My skin felt clammy. I could hear my pulse in my ears. Every time I glanced at that small exposed part of the mirror, the figure was still there, watching. It didn't move, but its head was turned toward me. After an hour of sheer anxiety, I grabbed the mirror by the frame, sheet and all, and carried it to the bedroom closet. I shoved it inside, closed the door, and pushed a dresser in front of the door. My heart pounded as I stepped away. My t-shirt stuck to my chest with sweat. I sat on the edge of my bed, waiting to see if I heard anything. Silence. I waited another hour. Nothing. I finally fell asleep around dawn, slumped against some pillows. I woke up late the next day, sore and stiff. The closet door was still blocked by the dresser. I slowly moved the dresser aside. I opened the closet door a crack. The mirror was still in there. The sheet was partially off, revealing half the glass. I couldn't see that hooded figure in the reflection. I placed the dresser back against the door and decided I'd leave it there for now. Over the next week, I kept that closet closed. I heard scraping sounds at night sometimes, but I tried to ignore them. I kept telling myself it couldn't hurt me if I didn't look. I hoped maybe it would vanish on its own or that I'd figure out a way to get rid of it for good. By Friday, I'd had enough. I drove around town until I found a pawn shop that took old furniture and antiques. I didn't ask questions about their policies. I just wanted to hand the mirror over and never see it again. I went home, got the mirror from the closet, carried it out to my car, and drove to that pawn shop. The owner gave me a questioning look, but I said I just needed to sell it cheap. He nodded, gave me a few bills, and wrote up a receipt. I left before he could change his mind. When I got home, my stomach was in knots, but I didn't see the mirror anywhere. I felt a deep sense of relief wash over me. That night I slept without interruptions. No knocking, no weird chair in the corner, no hidden door, no hooded figure. The next morning I woke up rested. I ate breakfast, tidied up the living room, and felt almost normal again. It stayed that way for 3 nights. On the 4th day I came home from work and found the mirror leaning against my kitchen counter. My knees almost gave out. The frame looked exactly the same, down to the worn carvings. There was a faint light bouncing off the glass, making the reflection of the kitchen look too sharp. I let out a shaky breath. The mirror was back again. My mind reeled. I had sold it. Someone else had it. There was no logical way for it to be here. At that moment, I saw a slight movement in the reflection. In the corner of the frame, that hooded figure stood near the hallway. My hands shook. The figure turned its head toward me. I couldn't see its face. My heart pounded in my ears, and I dropped my keys. I rushed out of the kitchen and locked myself in the bedroom, sliding down to the floor. My throat felt like it was closing up, and my eyes watered. For a while, I just sat there, unable to move. I don't know how to end this. The mirror is still here. I can't destroy it. I can't give it away. It always finds a way back. I close my eyes and hope it doesn't show me that chair, that door, or that figure again. But deep down, I know it will. Whenever I walk into my living room, I can feel its presence, waiting, reflecting a world that isn't mine. I've moved it to the corner, covered it with a blanket, but sometimes I catch a glimpse of something shifting under that cover. I try not to look too closely. I don't want to see what's there anymore. I just want it gone. Yet no matter what I do, it stays. And that's all I can say. I still remember the dull ache in my legs when I first stepped off the bus. The ride had taken longer than I expected because of the rough roads and constant stops. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was a place to rest. The driver pointed to a narrow dirt path that led toward a cluster of old buildings. I followed his directions with my backpack slung over one shoulder, feeling the cold wind brush against my face. I saw a wooden sign ahead that read, Valley Ridge Inn. The paint was chipping and the letters were crooked. I had a strange feeling in my stomach, but I assumed it was just the hunger and fatigue. I had no idea what was waiting for me behind that door. I walked up 2 steps that creaked under my weight. The front of the inn looked like it had been put together with spare lumber. I pushed the door open, and a small bell jingled above my head. Inside, a middle-aged man stood behind a makeshift counter. He wore a flannel shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. His eyes moved over me for a moment, and then he smiled. His wife appeared from a back room, wiping her hands on an apron. She nodded at me and asked if I was looking for a room. I said yes. They told me they had plenty of vacancies. The lobby was just a small area with a few chairs and a hallway leading to the rooms. The walls were a dull gray, and the floorboards squeaked under my boots. The man handed me a key with a wooden tag. The number 3 was carved into it with shaky lines. He said my room was at the end of the hall on the right. I paid for a couple of nights in advance and thanked him. He told me they didn't get many travelers, so I could expect a quiet stay. I felt relieved because I was desperate for rest. When I got to my room, I noticed the door had a rusty doorknob. I turned it slowly, and the door stuck for a second before it swung open. The room was small, with a single bed pushed against one wall and a small table near the window. There was a worn-out chair in the corner, and a single overhead bulb cast a pale light across the plain walls. I put my backpack on the floor and sat on the bed. The mattress sagged a bit, but I didn't mind. I was too tired to complain. I decided to unpack a few items. I set my wallet on the table, placed my phone next to it, and leaned my small travel mirror against the wall. I kicked off my boots and rubbed my feet. The room was chilly, so I got up to check if there was a heater or something similar. There was a small radiator near the foot of the bed. I turned the knob, but it didn't seem to do much. The temperature barely changed. I shrugged and grabbed a spare blanket from the closet. The closet itself had a squeaky door and a single wooden hanger. I draped the blanket over my shoulders, sat back on the bed, and looked around. The room felt plain and a bit eerie, but I tried to ignore that feeling. I decided to wash my face. The bathroom was at the opposite end of the hallway, shared by all guests. It had chipped tiles and a musty smell. I rinsed my face with cold water, then dried it off with a thin towel. On my way back, I noticed the hallway lights flickering. At first, I thought maybe the wiring was old. Then the lights steadied, and everything felt normal again. I stepped into my room and closed the door. That was when I saw that my phone wasn't where I had left it. It had been on the table, but now it was on the chair by the corner. I was certain I had left it on the table, yet there it was, balanced on the seat. I checked my surroundings. My wallet and mirror were still on the table, exactly where I had placed them. Confused, I picked up my phone and placed it back on the table. I thought maybe I had moved it without noticing. I decided not to dwell on it. Instead, I changed into comfortable clothes and got under the covers. The bed creaked whenever I shifted my weight, and the dull overhead light was giving me a headache, so I turned it off. I pulled the blankets up to my chin and tried to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a faint knocking sound. It was a soft tap, tap, tap on the door. I blinked a few times, trying to clear my head. The knocking came again. It was light but distinct. I sat up in bed, my heart thumping in my chest. I listened for a voice or footsteps in the hallway. I heard nothing except the wind outside. I was half asleep, so I thought maybe I was imagining it. But then I heard it again, a gentle knock. I got out of bed and walked to the door. My feet felt cold on the wood floor. I pressed my ear against the door and called out, "Hello?" There was no answer. I felt the doorknob, and it was steady. I opened the door a few inches and peeked into the hallway. It was dark and empty. I flipped the light switch in the hall. The bulb overhead flickered on, revealing the same dull walls and the same closed doors to the other rooms. I stood there for a moment, waiting to see if anyone would appear. There was no movement. I closed the door and locked it. My chest felt tight, and I noticed I was breathing faster than normal. My skin felt clammy, and the back of my neck was damp with sweat. I told myself it was just the wind rattling something outside. I got back into bed, but it took a while before my heartbeat slowed down. I eventually drifted off to sleep, telling myself it was nothing. The next morning I woke up and checked the table. My phone and wallet were where I had put them the night before. The mirror was still propped against the wall. I thought about the soft knocking and felt uneasy. I decided to go downstairs and get some breakfast, or at least a cup of coffee. When I stepped into the lobby, I saw the couple who ran the place. The husband was reading a newspaper at the counter, and the wife was in a small kitchen area to the side. They greeted me politely. I asked them if there were other guests staying at the inn. They shook their heads and said I was the only one. I mentioned the knocking I heard, hoping they would tell me someone else had arrived late. But they insisted I was the only guest who had checked in that week. The husband told me the building was old, and sometimes the pipes made strange noises. He said the wind could cause shutters to rattle. He seemed calm, and his explanation sounded logical. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I ate a simple breakfast of toast and coffee. The coffee tasted a bit stale, but it warmed me up. Afterward, I decided to explore the village. The streets were narrow and the houses looked old. Some had broken windows or chipped paint. I saw a small convenience store, a post office, and a boarded-up shop. The air smelled like wet soil and wood smoke. People seemed wary of me. A few nodded in my direction, but most kept to themselves. I walked around for a few hours, then returned to the inn in the late afternoon. When I got back to my room, I noticed something odd right away. The travel mirror I had set on the table was now on the windowsill. I had not moved it. My wallet was still on the table, but it was flipped open. My phone was in my pocket because I had taken it with me, so that wasn't disturbed. I stood there staring at the mirror for a minute. My mind raced. I felt a tingling sensation in my arms. I locked the door behind me and checked all the corners of the room. There was no one there. I slid open the closet door. It was empty, except for the wooden hanger. I got on my knees and looked under the bed. Nothing. I opened the small nightstand drawer. It was empty. My heart was pounding again. I couldn't figure out how my items had moved. I thought someone must have a key, but that made no sense. The couple insisted there were no other guests. I decided to speak with them again. I went downstairs and found the wife cooking dinner in the small kitchen. I told her about the items moving in my room. She frowned and said maybe I was forgetting where I left them. Her tone was polite but dismissive. She said she and her husband respected the privacy of their guests and never entered rooms without permission. I appreciated her words, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. That night, I lay in bed with the lamp on. I didn't feel comfortable in the dark. I left my wallet, phone, and mirror on the table again, each in a specific spot. I forced myself to stay awake, but my eyelids got heavy after a while. I started to doze off when I heard the soft knocking again. Tap, tap, tap. It sent a jolt of adrenaline through my chest. I sat up, my pulse racing, and stared at the door. My ears felt hot. The knocking came again. 3 gentle taps. I swung my legs out of bed and slowly approached the door. My palms were sweating. I gripped the doorknob and felt a small vibration through the metal. I stood there for a few seconds waiting. Then I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty, just like before. The light was on, and I saw no one. I checked the other doors. Rooms 1 and 2 were closed, and the rest were unoccupied. The hallway led straight to the lobby, but I didn't see any movement there. I felt a chill on the back of my neck. I went back into my room, locked the door again, and turned on every light I could find. I checked my belongings on the table. My phone was now angled differently. It faced the edge of the table as if someone had picked it up and put it down again. My wallet was closed, but it was shifted an inch to the left. I felt a rush of panic. My legs felt weak, and my throat went dry. I stepped back and knocked into the chair. I grabbed the back of the chair to steady myself. I stared at the phone and wallet for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard a quiet scuffling sound from the closet. It was faint, like something sliding across the floor. I looked at the closet door. It was shut. I walked over and put my ear to the wood. My heart was hammering. I could hear my own breath, short and shaky. I reached for the knob and opened the door. The closet was empty except for the single hanger. The walls were bare. The floor was clean. I felt a flush of confusion. My hands were trembling. I closed the closet door and stepped away. I barely slept that night. When morning came, I decided I should check out. I hurried downstairs with my things and found the husband at the counter again. I told him I needed to leave earlier than planned. He asked if everything was all right. I just said I had some urgent business to attend to back home. I didn't want to get into a long conversation about what had happened. I settled my bill for the extra day and asked if there was a bus schedule I could check. He pointed me to a small display near the entrance. While I was waiting for the next bus, I sat in the lobby. The wife brought me a cup of coffee to pass the time. She asked if I slept well. I told her I had trouble resting, but I didn't give details. She apologized for any inconvenience. I nodded and avoided eye contact. I could still feel a tightness in my chest. I heard the bus pull up outside and I stood. I thanked them for their hospitality, forced a polite smile, and stepped outside. The driver loaded my bag under the bus and I took a seat near the window. As the bus pulled away, I looked back at the inn. The wooden sign swayed in the wind and the windows looked dark. I felt a strange sense of relief as we left the dirt road behind. I tried to calm my thoughts. I wanted to pretend none of it had happened. But the memory of those soft knocks and the sight of my belongings moved around without explanation still lingered. My heart was still pounding even as the bus rolled down the road. I don't know what to believe. I don't know if someone was messing with me or if there was something else in that old inn. I only know what I experienced. I heard the knocks, saw my items in different places, and felt watched whenever I tried to sleep. I don't have proof. I only have my own memory of that empty hallway and those quiet taps on the door. I still think about it from time to time. I wonder if I was truly alone in that place. Even though I left, I can't get rid of that uneasy feeling in my gut. I doubt I ever will. I noticed the building on a quiet side street downtown. The exterior looked dull and worn. The windows seemed smaller than they should be. The owner advertised a cheap, spacious apartment on the third floor. That caught my attention. I needed a place fast, and the rent was lower than anything else around. I signed the lease without thinking much. A few days later, I carried my boxes inside and got my first close look at the lobby. It had chipped floor tiles and a stale smell. My gut felt uneasy, but I shrugged it off. I told myself I was just tired from moving. When I first climbed the stairs, I realized something was off. The hallway light was weak, and each step felt heavier than the last. I tried counting the steps as I went up because I wanted a quick mental distraction from the weight of the boxes in my arms. 1, 2, 3. I paused at 10, then lost track. It was frustrating. I assumed I was just too tired or stressed. I reached the third floor eventually, but I felt worn out and a little shaken. That first night I heard noises outside my apartment door. It sounded like shoes on the hallway floor, moving slowly back and forth. I thought maybe a neighbor was restless. I stood by the door and listened. The steps went on for a few minutes, then stopped. I checked the peephole. The hallway light was still on, but I saw no one. I opened the door a crack and peeked out. Empty hall, no sound. My heart was beating a little faster, but I closed the door and locked it. I told myself it was no big deal. The next day I left for work and decided to count the steps on my way down. I figured I was more awake and wouldn't lose count. I held the railing and started with a careful pace. 1, 2, 3, 4. My shoes squeaked a bit on the worn steps. At step 7, I got distracted by a faint odor. It was musty, like wet laundry that had been left out too long. When I tried to pick up the count again, I realized I couldn't remember if I was on step 8 or 9. It annoyed me more than it should have. I tried again from scratch. 1, 2, 3. By the time I got near the bottom, I lost it again. I reached the lobby, feeling frustrated and a bit unsettled. It's just stairs, I told myself. There was no reason to feel weird about it. I got home late that evening. The hall light on my floor flickered. I fumbled for my keys, opened my door, and froze when I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me. I was at the threshold of my place, but it sounded like someone was still coming up. Thump, thump, thump. I glanced over my shoulder. The stairwell door was closed and the hallway was empty, but I could still hear that slow, deliberate sound. I felt sweat on my palms. I hurried inside and shut the door. My heart pounded. I listened for a few seconds. The sound continued for a bit, then stopped. I told myself it was just a neighbor on their way to a different floor, but why didn't I see anyone? Over the next week, I kept noticing odd things around the stairs. Once I got to my floor after a long day at work. I wanted to double-check how many steps were there from the second floor landing to the third floor landing. I thought maybe I could measure them, or at least keep count without messing up. I began at the second floor landing, took 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Each step made a slight groan. After step 8, I paused to look up. The overhead light buzzed. I could see dust swirling in the beam. Then I continued. 9, 10, 11. The staircase turned at a small corner. I expected about 3 more steps to the top. Instead, I found 4. I ended up at a small extra step that didn't match the rest. I stood there, confused. I counted the steps again going down, but the number was different. I felt a chill move down my arms. I tried to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was playing tricks on me. At night, the footsteps in the hallway became more frequent. Sometimes they sounded slow and dragging, sometimes quick and sharp. Twice I opened my door fast, thinking I could catch whoever was out there. Each time the hall was empty. Not a single door had closed. Not a single person was turning a corner. Nothing. My chest felt tight each time, like my body was warning me to stay put. I tried talking to the building manager. He was a short, middle-aged guy with a stiff posture. He said nothing was wrong with the stairs. I told him how I kept losing count, how the landings felt uneven. He just stared at me. Then he said, "People been using those stairs for years. Never heard a complaint." I asked if anyone else in the building had mentioned strange noises at night. He shrugged and said, "This is an old place. You hear creaks sometimes." I didn't press it. His tone made it clear he didn't want to talk about it. On a Wednesday night, I decided to put this mystery to rest. After dinner, I grabbed a notepad, a pen, and a small flashlight. I figured I would write down the exact number of steps on each flight, from the first floor to the top. I started at the ground floor. The lobby was quiet and the overhead lights were dim. I began counting and writing each step number in the notepad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I reached the first landing, wrote down 10, and turned to the second set. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Another landing. I put down 11. I pressed on, trying to stay calm. At the second floor, I paused. I glanced down at the notepad. My handwriting looked shaky. I could hear a distant noise behind me, like a shoe scraping on concrete. I spun around, shining my flashlight. Nothing there. I went on. The next set of steps seemed normal at first. 1, 2, 3, 4. The light overhead flickered. My breath caught in my throat. The atmosphere felt heavier. I kept counting. 5, 6, 7, 8. The next step looked smaller somehow, but I still stepped on it. I wrote 9 on my pad. Then there was another one right above it, also a bit small. I wrote 10. I reached the landing, looking down at my notes. I had 10 steps on this flight, but the distance between the second floor and the third floor felt much longer than it should. I thought maybe I messed up, so I tried to check them one by one again. As I placed my foot back on the top step, I heard footsteps behind me, just like before. Thump, 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 in a steady rhythm. My heart pounded so hard I felt a dull pressure in my ears. I aimed the flashlight down. I saw no movement. The footsteps kept going. They were coming closer. I gripped the notepad, feeling sweat on my palm. The steps sounded like they were almost at my landing. I turned and took the last few steps to the third floor, two at a time. I reached the third floor hallway and pushed the door open. My hand was trembling. As soon as I entered the hallway, the footsteps seemed to pass right behind me and then fade into silence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I hurried to my apartment and locked the door. Over the next few days, the sense of unease grew. I tried taking the elevator sometimes, but the elevator felt shaky and made loud rattling noises. I didn't trust it. I told myself the footsteps were just in my head. Maybe I was exhausted. But each night, the same thing happened. I would come home, hear something on the stairs, or sense a presence in the hallway. Sometimes I felt a slight push of air behind me, like someone had brushed past. One evening, I got back from the grocery store and saw the building manager in the lobby. I noticed the light above him was flickering again. I asked him if the building had any past issues, plumbing, electrical, or structural. He just told me they had normal wear and tear. I tried to be polite, but I was pretty direct. "Are you sure there's nothing weird about the stairwell?" I asked. He crossed his arms. "You're the only one talking about it," he said. "If you're so unhappy, you can break your lease." I wasn't in a position to move again. I just said, "Never mind," and walked away. Later that night, I heard footsteps again as I climbed up to my place. I was holding a bag of takeout, and the hallway smelled like old paint. As soon as I passed the second floor, I heard that familiar thump. My chest tightened and I picked up the pace. But the footsteps also picked up. I reached the third floor door, opened it fast, and turned around. I stood in the doorway, looking at the stairs. They were empty. My breathing was short and my arms felt shaky. I stepped through and let the door close. The footsteps didn't stop immediately this time. They continued one more step, then silence. Inside my apartment, I set the food down and tried to calm my breathing. I felt ridiculous. I walked around the living room, turned on the TV, tried to focus on something else, but every little noise in the building made me jump. A few nights later, I decided to go to the basement to check the fuse boxes. I wanted to see if there was any sign of old wiring or something that could explain the flickering lights. The basement was accessible by the same staircase, so I headed down around 10 p.m. The halls were empty. My footsteps echoed as I went past the first floor. The door to the basement had a small sign that said maintenance only, but it wasn't locked. I walked in, pointed my flashlight around, and saw a dusty corridor with concrete floors. I found the fuse boxes, but everything looked normal to me. I didn't see any loose wires or anything obviously broken. As I turned to go back upstairs, I felt a shift in the air again. It was like someone was standing right behind me. A wave of cold moved over me. My stomach tightened. I spun around. No one there. But my flashlight flickered. For a second, I thought I saw a shape at the far end of the basement corridor, but it vanished when the light stabilized. My hand shook as I held the flashlight. I let out a grunt of frustration and hurried back to the stairwell. I climbed the steps, counting again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Every sound echoed. My shoes squeaked, and I could hear my breathing. Halfway up, I froze. Footsteps again from below. I tried to see who was there, but the stairwell was too dim. The steps sounded slow and steady, but there was no shape, no figure. They grew louder. I tried to control my breathing and keep moving. My legs felt weak. My heartbeat hammered in my chest. I reached the lobby level and almost sprinted to the next set of stairs leading up to my floor. As I started the climb to the third floor, the footsteps seemed to mirror my pace. If I sped up, they sped up. If I slowed down, they slowed down. I could almost feel a presence at my back, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw only empty steps. I didn't want to stand there and wait to see what happened. I pushed forward, taking 2 steps at a time. The footsteps followed, not missing a beat. My forehead was damp with sweat and I could feel my pulse in my neck. I wanted to scream, but I felt like it wouldn't help. I reached the 3rd floor, practically slamming my shoulder into the hallway door as I rushed through. The footsteps carried on for a moment longer, then stopped. My hands were shaking so much I dropped my keys. I picked them up, forced my door open, and locked it behind me. Inside, I paced back and forth, trying to catch my breath. My heart thudded in my ears. A dull headache formed behind my eyes. I stood in the center of my living room, every muscle in my body tense. I've been here for a month now. Every time I use the stairs, I lose track of the count. Sometimes I almost slip because I expect a step to be there, but it isn't, or I expect a landing and find another step instead. And no matter what time of day it is, the stairwell feels colder and darker than the rest of the building. The footsteps haven't hurt me. I don't see any reason to believe they will, but they won't go away. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear them outside my door. They move past, going up or down, never stopping. I've tried ignoring them, but I can't. My body reacts before I can think, and that nervous tension returns. I feel cornered in my own home, with this constant sense that something is following me every time I set foot on those stairs. I don't know how long I'll stay. The thought of moving again feels exhausting, but I also can't keep living with this tension. I've tried telling myself there must be some logical explanation. Old buildings have weird quirks, right? But there's something else here. When I'm on those stairs, counting each step, I feel my chest tighten and my hair stand on end. I can't see anything, but it's there. The footsteps. The extra steps that vanish or appear. The stale smell that floats around certain landings. The flickering lights that seem to pulse in time with my heartbeat. It all keeps me on edge. Every time I step through my front door, I wonder if I'll hear the footsteps again. I wonder if the stairs will have the same number of steps as before, or if they'll shift under my feet. My only plan is to take it day by day. I might try to find a new place, but money is tight and moving is a huge hassle. For now, I live here in this old building with a staircase that never adds up. The footsteps keep their own schedule, never showing me their source. And I keep walking, counting, and losing count, aware that something is right behind me, unseen and unnerving. I moved into this house 2 weeks ago. I thought it was just another place to call home with squeaky floors and dusty corners. That was my first mistake. Let me tell you exactly what happened, step by step, without dressing it up or trying to make sense of it. I'll just give you the details and hope you understand why I still feel uneasy every time I go upstairs. After I signed the papers and unloaded my boxes, I spent my first night in the living room, half asleep on a creaky couch. I had no furniture in my bedroom yet. I remember waking up around 2 a.m., feeling sweaty and disoriented. The air felt strange, like there was a slight draft coming from somewhere. I heard a faint noise overhead, maybe in the attic. It was like a soft tapping sound. I ignored it and fell back asleep. The next day, I decided to explore the attic. I hadn't been up there yet because I was too busy unpacking. I walked up the narrow steps, feeling a bit claustrophobic. The air was thick and smelled musty. I reached for the chain dangling from the bare bulb in the ceiling and pulled it. The light flickered a few times before staying on. The attic was empty except for a couple of wooden crates, an old trunk, and a sagging cardboard box. Cobwebs hung in the corners. I checked the crates first. They were full of yellowed newspapers and some rusty tools. Then I opened the trunk. Inside, I found some moth-eaten blankets and a small wooden box with a tarnished latch. When I lifted the lid of that wooden box, I saw an ornate key. It was gold-colored, heavy, and had a twisting, intricate design at the top. There was no tag or any hint about what it opened. I held it in my hand and felt a slight chill move through me. It was odd, but I didn't think much of it. I set it aside on one of the crates while I rummaged through the rest of the trunk. I found nothing else interesting. I stuffed the key in my pocket, thinking it was a neat little curiosity. Maybe it belonged to some old piece of furniture. I forgot about it for the rest of the day, focusing on cleaning the kitchen and setting up my bed in the master bedroom. That night I slept in my own bed for the first time in the new house. My dreams were weird, but I couldn't remember much detail the next morning. I felt groggy though, as if my mind had been racing all night. The following evening I was in the kitchen looking for something to eat when I saw the key again. It was on the countertop near the sink. I knew I had left it in my bedroom dresser drawer earlier that afternoon, but here it was. I felt a sudden jolt in my chest. I told myself I must have absent-mindedly carried it downstairs at some point. I shrugged it off, picked it up, and took it back to my room. I set it on top of my nightstand. That night, I woke up again, drenched in sweat. The dream had been chaotic. I remembered a narrow hallway, dark and unlit, leading to a door with a lock. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to catch my breath, but it felt like the room was pressing in on me. I looked at the nightstand. The key was gone. I turned on the lamp, scanning the floor around the bed. I found nothing. My hair stood on end, and my pulse throbbed in my temples. I got up, walked around the room, and checked everywhere. Still nothing. I sat on the bed, feeling a twist in my stomach. The next morning, I went downstairs to make coffee. I found the key on the coffee table. My mind started racing. I tried to think of a reasonable explanation. I came up blank. I stared at the key for a while, feeling a slight tremor in my hands. Finally, I decided to put the key back in the attic, hoping that would settle my nerves. I went up, opened the wooden box, and dropped the key inside. I left the attic and closed the door behind me. Then I put a small chair against the attic door, just to remind myself if it opened for any reason. That night, I had the same kind of dream. A dark hallway, a door, a lock, and a pressing sense of urgency. I felt like I needed to open that door, but I didn't have the key on me in the dream. I woke up around 3 a.m. My throat felt dry, and my heart was racing. I walked into the hallway, turned on the light, and looked up at the attic door. The chair was still there. The door was closed. I tried to calm myself. Then I went downstairs to get a drink of water. And there, on the kitchen table, was the key. I froze. My skin prickled and my breathing got shallow. I checked the attic. The wooden box was closed, but the key was gone from it. I lost track of time at that point. I just stared at the key on the table, feeling a steady pounding in my chest. I picked it up and tossed it in a drawer near the fridge. I slammed the drawer shut and went back to bed. My hands were shaking. When I finally fell asleep, the dream returned. This time I was inside a room I'd never seen before. It smelled stale. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper. I heard a low buzzing noise like old wiring or a faulty light fixture. My head felt heavy and I couldn't move. Then I woke up, heart pounding, shirt drenched in sweat. The next morning, I found the key on my pillow. I felt a rush of anger. I grabbed it and shoved it in my pocket. I walked around the house, opening closet doors, checking behind furniture, looking for any hidden door or lock that it might fit. Nothing. My frustration grew. I started to feel paranoid. I could hear every creak in the house, every tap of the pipes. I felt like someone was watching me, even though I knew I was alone. That afternoon, I decided to check every inch of the attic. I dragged a flashlight up there, pulled down a few loose boards, and searched for any hidden compartment. I found nothing, but I noticed a strange mark on the attic floor, a small circular stain about the size of a quarter. It looked darker than the surrounding wood. I touched it with my fingertips. It felt slightly sticky, like some kind of old residue, but I couldn't identify it. I shuddered and wiped my hand on my jeans. I went back downstairs, put the key in a kitchen drawer again, and locked the drawer with a small padlock I had lying around. I needed to see if it stayed put. That night I stayed up late, watching television with the volume down. I kept glancing toward the kitchen. I felt tense and my muscles ached from being on high alert. Around midnight I dozed off on the couch. When I woke up, it was almost 3 a.m. I walked over to the drawer, unclicked the padlock, and opened it. The key was gone. I felt a rush of adrenaline in my chest. I ran my hand over my face and tried to keep my breathing steady. Suddenly, I realized I was hearing something upstairs. It sounded like a dull thumping, as if someone was pacing around. I stood there in the kitchen, my heart thudding in my ears. I felt a knot in my stomach. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and headed to the stairs. My legs felt stiff, and the steps groaned under my weight. When I reached the top, I flipped on the hall light. I could still hear that thumping sound. I followed it to the second bedroom, a small room I hadn't furnished yet. It was empty except for some boxes and a single bare mattress on the floor. I stepped inside, shining the flashlight around. Suddenly, the door to the closet swung inward. I nearly dropped the flashlight. The key lay on the floor of the closet. I bent down to pick it up. My fingers twitched as I touched it. It felt colder than before. I looked around the closet. Nothing but a bare rod for hangers and a few cobwebs in the corners. My skin prickled, and my neck felt tense. I closed the closet door and went back to the hallway. The noise had stopped. I gripped the key in my hand so hard it hurt. I went back downstairs, placed the key on the coffee table, and just stared at it for a while. My mind was blank except for a steady mantra. This isn't possible. When I fell asleep again, the dream came back. This time I was standing in that strange room with peeling wallpaper. I ran my hand over the wall. I felt bits of paint and paper flaking off. There was a single door on the other side. I approached it and tried the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Then I woke up, gasping. I checked the clock. 5:15 a.m. I rubbed my face and noticed I was still on the couch. The key was on the table in front of me. My body felt exhausted, my muscles sore. I spent the next day avoiding the key. I left it on the table and tried to go about my chores. I fixed a loose doorknob, tightened a leaky faucet, and swept the living room floor. My eyes kept drifting over to the key, but I forced myself not to touch it. Around dinner time, I sat down with a sandwich and a soda, trying to distract myself with a random TV show. My eyes were burning from lack of sleep. I dozed off and woke up to the sound of something sliding across the floor. I jerked upright. The key was lying near my foot. It looked like it had been moved from the table to the floor. My throat tightened. I picked it up. I felt a chill through my arm. That night, the dream was more intense. I was in the room, and I could smell a damp, stale odor. My teeth were chattering. I walked toward the door. The key appeared in my hand. I felt the metal press against my palm. I fit the key into the lock, and it turned with a click. The door swung open, revealing a dark hallway that seemed to stretch on. I took one step forward, and everything went black. Then I woke up on the floor by my couch. My arms and legs felt numb. I decided I had to find that room in real life, or at least figure out if it was part of my house. I spent the entire morning searching. I checked every door, every closet, every corner. I measured the walls to see if there was any hidden space. I found nothing. My frustration boiled over and I yelled in the empty house, my voice echoing. Then I noticed something odd. The layout of the house didn't match the original floor plans. There was a small discrepancy in one corner near the guest bedroom, like there should be a little more space behind the wall than there was. The difference was only a couple of feet, but it stood out to me. I grabbed a hammer from the garage and walked to that spot. I tapped on the wall, listening for a hollow sound. After a few tries, I found a spot that sounded different. My pulse jumped. I broke through the drywall, creating a hole big enough to see inside. There was a small, unfinished space, nothing more than a narrow crawl area with some exposed beams and insulation. I stuck my head in, shining a flashlight. I felt the temperature drop slightly. The air smelled stale. My breath sounded louder than normal. I crawled in, careful not to catch my shirt on the wooden beams. I reached the far end of the crawl space. The only thing there was a small door, maybe 3 feet high. It had a latch and a keyhole. I felt my heartbeat speeding up. I pulled the key from my pocket. My hand shook as I placed it into the lock. It fit perfectly. I turned it and the latch released. A cold rush of air hit my face. The door creaked open. I shined the flashlight inside and saw a tiny room, barely large enough for me to crawl into. The walls had old peeling wallpaper with a pattern of flowers. The air felt thick. My eyes watered from the musty smell. I crawled inside. My body felt tense, and my mouth tasted bitter. The flashlight flickered for a moment. The room was empty with no furniture or windows. The wallpaper was the same ugly pattern from my dream. My hands felt clammy, and sweat ran down my back. There was nothing else inside, just stale air and darkness. Then I heard a soft scraping noise behind me. I spun around. The door slammed shut. My flashlight caught it just as it closed. I tried to push it open, but it felt jammed. My heart pounded. I kicked at it, grunting and cursing until it finally gave way. I pushed it open and scrambled back into the crawl space, panting. My hands were shaking violently. I slid out of the wall and into the bedroom, my knees hitting the floor. I pressed my ear to the opening. All I heard was my own rapid breathing. I stood up, back aching, and stared at the hole I had made. I wanted to seal it up and pretend I'd never found that little door, but something told me that wouldn't help. The key was still in my hand. My skin felt clammy, and I noticed that my breathing was shallow and quick. I moved through the house, shutting off every light. I just wanted to get out of there for a while. I picked up my car keys and left the ornate key on the hallway floor right near that hole. I locked the front door behind me and walked to my car. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, trying to block out the memory of that cramped, suffocating space. My body felt drained, and my thoughts were scattered. I needed fresh air and a sense of normalcy. That's all I can tell you right now. It's the truth, exactly how it happened. I haven't gone back into that hidden room since that day. I left the key on the floor next to the crawl space. I don't know if it moved or if it's still there. I'm too tired to check again. Maybe tomorrow I'll try to figure out what's really going on. For now, I just need to breathe and remind myself that I'm still in control of my own house. But every time I close my eyes, I see that peeling wallpaper and smell the stale air. And every time I open them, I half expect to see that key on the table, waiting for me to pick it up again. I still remember the exact moment it started. It was last Tuesday afternoon, right after lunch. I was sitting at my desk, sorting through some paperwork, when I heard a strange, rhythmic sound. It was so faint at first that I assumed it was a distant construction machine or maybe the pipes in the office walls. I checked under my desk, stood up, walked around, and pressed my ear against the wall. I didn't see or hear anything unusual besides that low thumping that seemed to hover in the background. But nobody else in the office turned their heads. Nobody made a comment about any weird noise. I knew something was off, but I kept quiet. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I stayed at work a couple more hours trying to concentrate on spreadsheets and phone calls. That pulsing sound stayed with me. It grew a little louder when I stepped into the supply closet to grab some printer paper. Inside that small room, the hum felt more persistent. It had a pattern, something like a slow, steady heartbeat. I felt uneasy. I inhaled deeply and noticed my hands felt damp. My pulse picked up and my stomach felt tight. I tried to focus on my breathing until it passed. Then I returned to my desk, but the sound never went away. When I left the office around 5 p.m., I took the elevator down to the lobby. The doors slid open and I stepped out. The sound was still there, humming in the back of my head. I looked around the lobby, noticing people in line for the security desk. They were chatting or scrolling on their phones. Nobody seemed aware of any repetitive noise. I went outside. Traffic was heavy, and I heard horns and engines revving. The strange sound almost vanished under the roar of the street. But as soon as things got quiet, at the crosswalk or in a short lull between passing cars, it came back. It was like a subtle thump, thump, thump that never quit. I tried to ignore it on my drive home. I turned up the radio, but I still felt that thumping in my ears. I even rolled down the window for a while, hoping the wind would drown it out. It didn't help. I pulled into my apartment building's parking lot, grabbed my laptop bag, and headed inside. In the elevator up to my floor, that same sound got louder. The elevator was mostly silent, aside from a soft mechanical whir, and the rhythmic thumping felt more intense. I shifted from foot to foot, wondering if I was losing my mind. My neck felt stiff. My mouth went dry. I felt a slight tremor in my right hand when I reached to press the button for my floor again, just to distract myself. When I got into my apartment, I dropped my bag in the living room and stood still for a moment. The lights were off, and the place felt quiet. That was when I realized the sound was just as strong as ever. It was a steady beat, not too fast, not too slow. I flicked on a lamp and walked through each room, listening. It didn't come from a pipe or an air vent. It felt like it was inside my head, but not quite like tinnitus. It had a distinct shape, almost like tapping. I turned on the TV for a while, hoping to block it out. The noise from the TV made it less noticeable, but whenever I muted the volume, I could hear that pulse again. That night, I barely slept. The rhythmic noise got louder when everything else was silent. I tossed and turned, pressing my hands against my ears. It made no difference. The sound was there, mocking me. I forced myself to get at least a few hours of sleep by leaving a fan on. The soft hum of the fan drowned out the worst of it. Still, I felt twitchy and restless. The next morning, I walked into the office feeling groggy. I paused at my cubicle and glanced around at my coworkers. They were sipping coffee, talking about their evenings. I waited for someone to mention a weird sound. Nobody did. So I approached a friend of mine, Eric, and asked if he'd noticed anything odd. A low, steady thumping around the office. He raised an eyebrow and shook his head. He told me everything seemed normal, then asked if I was feeling okay. I nodded, but I felt my palms sweat. I realized this was something only I could hear. The next few days felt like a blur. That sound followed me everywhere. At work, it lingered behind the buzz of fluorescent lights. In my car, it surfaced when the engine idled at a red light. In the elevator, it felt stronger. It became worse in quiet places. My living room, a bathroom stall at the office, or the back hallway near the vending machines. I started avoiding silent areas. I spent more time in busy spots with background noise. Sometimes I even walked outside during breaks, staying near traffic or near people talking on their phones. It was my way of trying to escape the rhythmic tapping that wouldn't leave me alone. One evening, I decided to record the sound with my phone. I hoped I could capture it, play it back, and see if there was some explanation. I sat in my apartment, turned off the TV, and hit the record button. I let it run for a couple minutes. Then I played it back at full volume. There was nothing but faint white noise. No thumping, no tapping. I felt a chill wash over me. My chest felt tight, and my hands shook a little. I knew this wasn't something external. It was either in my head or something that I picked up that nobody else could. I contacted my primary care doctor and scheduled an appointment. A few days later, I sat in the clinic waiting room, listening to that infernal tapping while the TV on the wall played some talk show. Once I got into the exam room, I explained my symptoms. The doctor checked my ears, ran a basic hearing test, and asked a bunch of questions about my lifestyle and stress levels. Everything came back normal. She recommended seeing an audiologist, but suggested it could be stress-related tinnitus. I left feeling frustrated and unsettled. The next week I visited the audiologist, and that exam didn't reveal anything conclusive either. My hearing was fine. Around that time I noticed something new about the sound. It wasn't just a random thumping. It had tiny pauses and variations. Sometimes I heard 3 beats, then a brief silence, then 1 beat, then silence, and so on. It felt like some kind of coded message. I struggled to wrap my head around it, but I started writing down the patterns I noticed. I filled a few pages of a small notebook with sequences of numbers that represented how many taps I heard before a pause. I still couldn't make sense of it, but I wanted some record of it. At times I felt a tightness in my chest and shortness of breath when the pattern got more insistent. I became more anxious. I woke up in the middle of the night covered in sweat, my heart hammering as that sound played on repeat. The walls of my bedroom felt closer. I got up, turned on all the lights, and paced around. My hands were trembling, and I felt a prickling sensation in my scalp. I tried turning on the TV, but the late-night infomercials didn't distract me. The tapping was louder than ever in that quiet space. I tried standing by the window to hear the distant traffic, but it was too late, and the street was mostly empty. I slapped my hands over my ears, but that did nothing. It was inside me somehow. One Saturday, I decided to get out of the apartment and go for a drive. I thought maybe if I took a long trip on the highway, the road noise might help. I drove a couple of hours upstate, stopping at rest areas to refuel and grab coffee. At first, the wind and the engine noise made me feel calmer, but as soon as I parked in a quiet spot, that tapping rushed back. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, feeling my heart thumping in my chest. I could barely tell if the beat I felt was my actual pulse or that strange noise. I stepped outside, walked around, stretched my legs, and looked at the other travelers. They were pumping gas, getting snacks, chatting. They seemed normal. Nobody reacted to this noise that was consuming me. A few days later, at work, I noticed a sharper pattern to the tapping. It felt like it was trying to guide me. I know that sounds strange, but I swear it changed whenever I moved in certain directions around the office. I started experimenting. If I walked into the break room, the tapping would slow down. If I walked near the staircase at the end of the hall, it would speed up. I felt a wave of sweat rolling down my forehead. My breathing got shallow. My legs felt heavy. Part of me wanted to run out of the building and never come back, but I forced myself to follow that faster pattern. I walked down the stairs floor by floor, listening to the tapping get more urgent. By the time I reached the basement, I was sweating through my shirt. My heart pounded in my ears. I stood there in the dimly lit hallway, scanning the plain walls, the utility doors, the empty storage rooms. Nothing stood out. The tapping slowed again. I felt shaky. I left as fast as I could. At home that night, I tried to piece together those patterns I'd written down in my notebook. I set it on my coffee table and stared at the numbers. They didn't form words or anything obvious. They were just sequences of 3, 1, 4, 5, 2, and so on. I tried tapping them out with my finger on the table, hoping to notice something. All I noticed was my own heavy breathing and the tension in my shoulders. After about an hour, I gave up. The tapping in my head was still there, but I was too drained to keep at it. I turned on some random show and fell asleep on the couch. The next week, I found myself more jumpy than usual. I'd flinch if a phone rang unexpectedly or if someone called my name. The tapping never stopped, and it seemed to grow louder every day. Some nights, I woke up shaking, my shirt drenched. My chest burned like I was out of breath. My stomach felt knotted up. I couldn't remember the last time I slept through the night without that sound jarring me awake. I started drinking more coffee during the day just to stay alert, but that made me even more on edge. Then one night, I tried a different approach. I turned everything off in my apartment, TV, phone, computer, lights, until it was pitch black. I focused on the tapping and tried to respond to it by knocking on the wall, mimicking the pattern I heard. I did 3 knocks, paused, 1 knock, paused. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my heartbeat racing, but I kept it up. I tried to match the tapping I heard in my head. I sat there for about 20 minutes listening and knocking. I noticed the tapping in my head shifting. It started to slow. Then it changed to 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Pause. I matched it. My heart pounded so hard I felt lightheaded. My legs felt weak, but something in me felt compelled to keep going. Eventually, I stopped. My throat was dry and my muscles ached. I turned on the lights and looked around. The apartment was as empty as ever, but the tapping was still there, now back to its original steady pattern. I didn't sleep much that night. I stared at the ceiling, feeling my pulse in my temples. Over the next few days, I tried the same approach in different rooms. I'd wait for the tapping to change, then try to respond with taps on the furniture or the walls. Sometimes it would shift in response, but I never got anything I could clearly understand. It felt like the tapping was acknowledging me when I mimicked it. My thoughts felt jumbled, and I was always on the verge of a panic attack. My stomach churned whenever I thought about this weird conversation I was having with a noise that no one else heard. I told one colleague about it again. I cornered him in the break room and asked if he'd ever experienced phantom sounds. He said no and gave me a wary look. He asked if I was all right. I realized I was sweating and breathing heavily as I asked. I forced a laugh and changed the subject, but I knew he thought I was acting strange. I started avoiding people because I didn't want them to see how anxious I was. My boss asked if I was okay too, because I'd been missing deadlines. I tried to reassure him that I was just dealing with some stress at home. Yesterday, I stayed late at the office to catch up on work. I was alone in my cubicle around 8 p.m. The open plan area was almost silent. That was when the tapping got really strong. It sounded sharper, like a pen clicking again and again. I felt a strong urge to get up and walk. I left my chair, and the tapping changed. 2 taps, pause, 1 tap, pause, 3 taps. My breath caught in my throat, my back muscles tensed, and my hands felt clammy. I walked toward the elevator. The tapping sped up. I pressed the button, and the doors opened. I rode it down to the lobby, feeling that rapid beat in my head. The lobby was empty, and the security guard was gone for the night. I stepped outside, and the city lights glowed in the distance. The traffic was lighter at that hour. My car was one of the few in the parking lot. The tapping gradually slowed as I walked. I reached my car, unlocked it, and sat behind the wheel. I felt a surge of dizziness and had to close my eyes. After a few seconds, I put the key in the ignition. The tapping was still there, right behind my ears. Now, as I'm telling this, I can feel it even while I sit here. It's a steady beat, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing down. It's with me every morning when I open my eyes. It's with me every night when I close them. It never fully disappears, though it fades a bit when there's enough external noise. It becomes the loudest when I'm alone in a quiet place. I sometimes feel sick to my stomach from the stress of it. My neck aches from how tense I keep my shoulders. I don't know what it wants or why I'm the only one who hears it. I keep hoping it'll stop. I've tried ignoring it, fighting it, responding to it, and nothing has worked. It's always there, following me, and I don't know how to make it leave. I heard my name coming from the bottom of a dry well on my first afternoon in that new house. I had closed on the place a week before, but I hadn't spent much time in the backyard. It looked like a mess of overgrown weeds, uneven dirt, and random piles of junk left behind by the previous owner. The well stood near a crooked fence surrounded by loose stones. I didn't even notice it until I tripped on some tangled roots and nearly fell face first into the opening. The top was partially covered by an old piece of plywood. When I steadied myself and bent down to move the board, I heard a distorted sound that resembled my name. It was faint and drawn out, like a muffled echo. Aaron. I froze right there, my heart pounding so hard I felt a throbbing in my neck. I knelt beside the well and peered inside. The shaft looked deep, maybe 20 or 30 feet. The interior was made of stacked stones, all rough and wet from decades of moisture. But it wasn't wet enough to hold water. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it down. The beam illuminated the bottom, which looked like dirt and broken bits of rock. There was no movement. I didn't see any animals or people down there. I listened. I heard nothing except my own breathing. After a moment, I decided I must have imagined that sound. My nerves were shot from the stress of moving. I stood up, dusted off my jeans, and told myself I needed to calm down. The next day, I returned to the backyard to clear out some debris. I wanted to rip out the weeds and maybe set up a small garden or a shed eventually. I walked over to the well again, now curious about its condition. That's when I heard it a second time. It was the same distorted version of my name, stretched and ugly, like someone was trying to shout but couldn't quite form the words. Hi, Aaron. I dropped the rake I was holding and felt a tingle in my arms. My mouth went dry. I took a few steps back, staring down at the well opening. The plywood cover was off to the side, so the hole gaped at me, black and damp. I crouched down slowly. My heart pounded in my ears. I whispered, "Hello?" I aimed my voice at the opening. I didn't hear anything for about 10 seconds. Then something rustled far below. It sounded like a scraping against stone. My mind started racing. I considered the possibility of an animal or some old pipe shifting under the dirt. But that didn't explain the name. That didn't explain the thick, drawn-out syllables that sounded like a broken tape recording of someone calling me. I decided not to mention it to anyone. I didn't have many close friends in this new town, and I didn't want people to think I was losing it. I spent the rest of that afternoon trying to ignore the well. I focused on mowing the small patches of grass that weren't choked by weeds. But every time I turned my back on the well, I felt like something was watching me. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. My skin crawled when I saw the dark hole. It seemed deeper than before, like a pit that stretched into endless darkness. By sunset, I was exhausted, and I went inside to fix a quick dinner. That night, I lay in bed, thinking about what I had heard. My mind replayed the distorted name. I couldn't pinpoint any logical explanation. Part of me wanted to fill the well with dirt and forget about it, but another part of me was curious. The next morning, I decided I'd drop a rope ladder down and see if there was some hidden compartment or echo chamber. I'm not sure why I even considered that. I guess I just wanted answers, and I didn't like feeling spooked in my own backyard. The following day, I woke up early. I went to a hardware store and bought some rope and a battery-powered lantern. I spent a couple of hours rigging a basic pulley system on a sturdy tree branch near the well. I tied off the rope ladder so it would hang down. Then I carefully shined my lantern inside. The stones still looked damp, and there was a musty smell that wafted up. It reminded me of a wet basement, that stale, cold odor that hits you in the face. I took a deep breath and told myself it was probably safe. I lowered the rope ladder inch by inch, letting the lantern dangle from a hook so I could see the bottom. Once it touched the dirt floor, I noticed some broken wood fragments and a few rusted metal objects that might have been parts of a bucket pulley system. There wasn't much else. No hidden door, no water, just dirt and stones. I called out, "Hey, is anyone down there?" The echo bounced back. I listened carefully. No answer, no whisper of my name. I felt somewhat relieved. I climbed down slowly. My boots clanked against the rungs of the ladder. The walls felt cold when my shoulders or elbows brushed the stones. I kept my eyes on the ground as I descended. At one point, my foot slipped, and I felt my stomach lurch, but I caught myself before falling. My breath came in short bursts. The air in the well felt heavy, and I tasted the metallic hint of damp stones. I reached the bottom, pointed my lantern around, and saw mostly packed dirt and old scraps of wood. There were some worms wriggling by my feet. I turned in a full circle and looked up, seeing the round opening with daylight streaming in. I stayed down there for a few minutes, checking the walls for any cracks or hidden spaces. I saw some small holes where mice might have burrowed. I found a rusty nail that I picked up. I kept expecting to hear my name or sense some presence, but it stayed quiet. Eventually, I felt foolish and climbed back up. My arms ached from holding onto the rope ladder, and my hands felt sweaty despite the cool air. Once I reached the yard again, I took a moment to breathe. That's when I heard a sound from behind me. It was the same scraping noise I'd heard before, only this time it was closer. I turned around fast, nearly dropping the lantern. The well looked the same as ever, dark and motionless. But I felt the hair on my arm standing straight up. I decided I'd had enough for one day. I went inside, threw my jacket on a chair, and took a hot shower. As the water ran down my back, I kept thinking about that sound. It was like something was sliding against the wall of the well. But I hadn't seen anything down there. I told myself it might be a rat or a piece of debris shifting. I tried to relax, but my nerves were on edge. I spent the rest of the evening pacing around the living room and checking my phone for any texts or notifications. Nothing came. I felt isolated. That night I heard it again, but this time I was inside the house. I was lying on my couch watching a late-night show with the volume low. My eyes were drooping and I was about to doze off. Then I heard that stretched out call. Aaron. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It came from outside, like someone was standing in the yard. I shot up from the couch and stared at the back door. My heart felt like it was skipping beats. I reached for the remote and turned off the TV, leaving the room in near darkness except for a small lamp in the corner. I walked to the window and peeked through the blinds. The backyard was dimly lit by a weak porch light. The well was just visible as a silhouette of stone. I strained my eyes. At first, I didn't see anything moving. Then I caught a glimpse of something near the well's edge, a faint, grayish shape that shifted in the darkness. It had a wispy outline, like a thin layer of fog. My breath caught in my throat. It started to rise. I saw it lift up from the well, almost like steam rising from boiling water, except it was slower and more defined. My stomach churned. My arms broke out in goosebumps. My instincts told me to lock the door, turn off the lights, and hide. But I couldn't look away. I leaned closer to the window, pressing my forehead to the glass. My heart pounded so loud I heard it in my ears. The shape seemed to hover above the well's edge. It wavered, then shifted toward the house. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a small footstool. My mind screamed at me to do something. I ran to the back door and made sure it was locked. Then I flipped off the lamp so there was less chance of being seen from outside. I pressed my back to the wall and listened. The house felt too quiet, like the air had thickened and swallowed all the usual nighttime noises. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting for a sound or a knock on the door. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then I heard a light tapping on the window to my left. I turned my head slowly, feeling a crackling sensation in my chest like my lungs had frozen. The tapping continued, a dull, steady sound against the glass. My mouth went dry. I took a step toward the window and my legs felt shaky. I moved the curtain aside a fraction of an inch. I saw that grayish shape drifting against the pane. It didn't have a face or limbs I could make out. It was more like a smoky outline, but I sensed it looking at me. I felt an intense chill spread across my face and arms. My teeth chattered once. I let the curtain drop and pressed my back to the wall again. The tapping stopped. My ears started ringing with the silence. After a few seconds, I heard a slight scraping sound, almost as if something was dragging itself away from the window. The porch light flickered outside, casting moving shadows across the yard. I stayed in place for a long time, trying to calm my breathing. I didn't dare open the door or the window. Eventually, I crept back to the living room. I sat on the couch, knees shaking, trying to wrap my head around what I had just seen. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lights off in every room and stayed alert. My ears were tuned to the faintest noise. Around 2 a.m, I dozed off for a moment, only to jolt awake when I thought I heard footsteps on the back porch. But when I checked, no one was there. The rest of the night dragged on. My eyes stung from exhaustion. In the morning, I gathered enough courage to step outside. The early sunlight made everything look less threatening. The well stood in the same spot, silent and still. I walked over slowly, feeling my stomach twist. There were strange marks on the stones near the top, like thin scratches. I touched one of them. The scratch felt shallow but fresh, like something had scraped across the surface during the night. I looked around for footprints but only saw my own. I even checked the grass, which was wet with dew, but I didn't see any clear disturbances. I spent most of that day inside the house, avoiding the backyard. I needed a break. My nerves were shot, and I felt like I was on the edge of a panic attack. I tried watching some random shows to distract myself. I texted a friend from my old city, but I didn't mention the well or the strange figure. I just said the move was stressful. I guess I was too embarrassed to talk about hearing my name called from a dry well or seeing some shape climb out of it. As evening came, I felt my anxiety ramping up. I cooked some dinner, but I barely tasted it. My stomach was in knots. Eventually, I couldn't ignore the backyard anymore. I had to know if it was safe. I stepped onto the porch, carrying a flashlight. The sky was dark, and clouds covered the moon. The only light came from my small porch fixture. I scanned the area with the flashlight, moving the beam slowly. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't relax. I gripped the flashlight with sweaty palms. I forced myself to walk toward the well. My feet felt heavy on the grass. My breath was shallow. I approached the edge and I aimed the flashlight down into the hole. The stone walls glowed in the beam. I saw nothing unusual. No shapes, no movement. Then I called out, "Is anyone there?" My voice cracked a bit. The well answered with a short echo. My heart pounded. I waited. Silence. The tension in my chest released a little. I told myself it was over. Maybe just some freak hallucination from stress. As soon as I turned to head back, I heard a loud scraping sound behind me. It was so sharp it made me flinch and drop the flashlight. The beam landed on the ground, pointing at my feet. I spun around and faced the well again. The scraping continued, like something was scratching the inside wall. My neck tightened and my eyes felt dry as I stared. Then I heard it for the third time. Aaron. It was louder now, not quite a whisper. It had a guttural edge, like it was coming from a throat clogged with dirt. I picked up the flashlight with trembling hands and shone it down into the well. I saw movement on the side of the wall, about 5 feet from the bottom. A grayish shape slid upward as if defying gravity. It hugged the stones and then reached the top. I stumbled back, almost falling. The shape rose into the air again, just like the night before, forming that hazy silhouette above the well. I heard the rasp of my own breathing. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped the flashlight again. That was enough for me. I backed away, not taking my eyes off the shape. It drifted in my direction for a moment, but I kept moving. I reached the porch, flung the door open, and rushed inside. Once I slammed it shut, I locked it and killed the porch light. My chest felt tight, and my arms tingled. I stood there in the dark, trying to steady myself. My shirt was soaked with sweat. I didn't go back out that night. I stayed by the window, glancing through a small gap in the curtain every few minutes. I never saw the shape again that evening, but I heard more scraping sounds until about midnight. After that, everything went quiet. I stayed up until dawn, watching the yard. Now I'm sitting here at my kitchen table telling you all of this. My hands are still trembling. It's morning again, and the well is out there, quiet and still. But I know what I saw. I know something crawled out of that well. I can't explain it, and I can't pretend it was my imagination. That shape was real. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it's going to keep calling my name. But I feel it out there. I keep checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that gray outline drifting across the yard. I'm not sure what I'll do next. Maybe I'll try to seal the well somehow. Maybe I'll just sell this place and move. Right now, I don't have any grand plan. All I know is that I can't keep living with that thing in my backyard. I hear the scraping in my head even when it's silent. My throat feels tight whenever I think about the voice calling me. I don't know if it's trying to get inside my house or if it's just stuck in the yard. Either way, I can't ignore it anymore. That well is not empty. It's holding something that shouldn't be there, and it knows my name. I got out of the car that night feeling tense. The air was colder than I expected, and my hands shook a little as I locked the door. I had heard stories about strange lights on this mountain trail, but I'd never seen anything like that myself. My plan was simple: hike a few miles, set up camp, and wait to see if the rumors were true. People said there were these glowing orbs in the sky that appeared without warning. Some blamed weather. Others whispered about secret military tests. I wanted to find out for myself. I wore thick boots, heavy pants, and a jacket with a hood. I strapped on my backpack, which held a small tent, a flashlight, some water, and a few snacks. I had a compact camera too, just in case I saw anything worth recording. The trail was marked by old wooden signs. They looked worn out and faded. As I started walking, I noticed how dark the sky was. No moon, no stars, just a black sheet overhead. I turned on my flashlight and followed the path. Gravel crunched under my feet, and the smell of damp earth and pine surrounded me. The wind whistled around some nearby rocks, giving me a shiver I couldn't ignore. After about an hour on the path, I reached a small clearing. The ground looked level enough for my tent, and I decided that was good enough. I set down my pack and stretched my arms. My breath formed little clouds in the cold air. Everything felt quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath. Normally, I like being in remote places, but that night, the silence made me uneasy. I pulled out my tent and set it up. My hands were stiff, and I fumbled with the tent poles. Once it was up, I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and switched off my flashlight to test how dark it was. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I turned the flashlight back on and walked around the clearing a bit. I checked my watch and saw it was around 9 p.m. The hike had tired me out, but I knew I wouldn't sleep right away. My eyes kept moving to the sky, searching for anything unusual. The temperature kept dropping, and I felt a chill run from my neck down my spine. It was the kind of cold that makes your joints ache. I decided to heat some water for tea. I had a small stove in my backpack. I placed it on a flat rock and lit it. The blue flame hissed. I poured water into a metal mug and waited. The sound of water heating was a relief in that silence. While I waited for the water to boil, I walked to the edge of the clearing. The trees stood tall, their bark rough and dark. I could see faint shapes of mountain peaks beyond them. The sky remained empty, no stars, no lights, just a black void. I turned off my flashlight to let my eyes adjust, hoping I might catch a glimpse of something. At first, I saw nothing. Then my eyes picked up faint outlines of the treetops against the sky, but there were no floating orbs, no beams of light. I sipped my tea, which was too hot at first. The warmth spread through my chest and stomach, easing my tension a bit. I paced around, scanning the horizon. After about 15 minutes, I got restless. My plan was to stay awake as long as possible, just in case. But the cold got stronger, and my breath felt labored. I went back to my tent, crawled inside, and closed the flap. I decided to rest my eyes for a moment, setting an alarm on my phone for midnight. The ground felt hard beneath my sleeping bag, but I managed to doze off. When my phone alarm buzzed, I jolted awake. My heart pounded as I remembered where I was. My tent felt stuffy, so I unzipped the flap and peered outside. The clearing looked still. The air was colder than before. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. My boots sank into the dirt. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches around me. I clicked my flashlight around, but I only saw the usual shapes: trees, boulders, the outline of my car far down the trail. I switched off the flashlight and stood there, letting my eyes adjust again. The wind died down and everything went still. Then I felt something. It was like a static charge in the air. My hair stood on end. My skin tingled. I stared at the sky, and out of nowhere, a bright flash lit up the entire area. It wasn't like a slow glow or a flicker. It was an intense burst of light, like a giant spotlight shining down on me. I staggered back, raising my arm to shield my eyes. The light was so strong that I couldn't keep them open for more than a split second. My heart thumped like I'd just sprinted a mile. I could hear my pulse pounding in my head. I tried to blink, but all I saw were bright spots and swirling colors. My eyes stung, and I panicked because I couldn't see anything but white flashes. I dropped to one knee and tried to steady my breathing. My skin felt hot, even though the air was freezing. I heard a faint humming or buzzing noise that seemed to vibrate in my ears. Then everything went black. I lost all sense of time for a few seconds. My thoughts raced, and I wondered if I'd been struck by something or if I was having some kind of medical problem. I don't know how long I stayed crouched like that. Eventually, I managed to blink some vision back. My eyes adjusted, but they felt strained, like I'd stared at the sun for too long. I forced myself to stand up, even though my legs felt shaky. When I looked around, I noticed something was off. The clearing I had chosen earlier now looked different. The ground was covered in a thin layer of gray dust, and the trees seemed taller and more spaced out than before. The rocks were in different positions, almost as if they had been rearranged. My tent was still there, but it looked twisted, like someone had yanked one of the tent poles sideways. I didn't hear the usual forest sounds. No wind, no rustling leaves, no insects. The air felt thick, and I caught myself holding my breath. Then I heard something else, a deep, heavy breathing. It wasn't mine. It came from somewhere behind me. I spun around, squinting in the darkness, trying to spot the source. My flashlight had fallen on the ground, so I picked it up and clicked it on. The beam was weak, probably because the batteries had drained, but it was enough to show me faint shapes. I couldn't see any person or animal, but I heard that slow, raspy inhale and exhale. It had a pattern, like someone with a chest cold trying to breathe. My hands started to sweat, and I felt my heart pounding again. I swept the flashlight around the clearing. The dust in the air made the beam hazy. I walked a few steps toward where I thought the sound was coming from. Each step kicked up more of that gray film on the ground. It smelled like burnt metal. When I got closer to a thick cluster of rocks, the breathing grew louder. I tried to focus on the space between the rocks. My eyes strained, and I felt a jolt in my chest when I realized there was a shape there, crouched low. It looked bigger than a person, but smaller than a bear. The outline was hard to define in the weak light. My stomach tightened, and I considered running back to my tent and zipping it shut, but that felt pointless. If this thing wanted to come near me, a thin layer of nylon wouldn't stop it. I raised the flashlight higher and stepped forward. My mouth felt dry. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I could see the shape shift. It looked like it was turning its head toward me. Its breathing paused. For a moment, there was absolute silence. My heart hammered so hard that my chest hurt. I couldn't see any eyes or face, just a dark mass. I was aware of my shaky legs and sweaty palms. My mind screamed at me to run, but I held my ground, too shocked to move. Suddenly, the shape made a shuffling motion and scurried off to the left, behind a large boulder. I heard a scraping noise like claws on rock. My breath came in quick bursts. I realized I was holding the flashlight in a death grip, and my knuckles were white. I took a few more steps, trying to see if there was a path behind the boulder. The gray dust on the ground looked disturbed, like something had crawled over it. My eyes darted in every direction. I realized how alone I was. I swallowed hard and tried to calm my thoughts. I didn't know what I'd just seen. My mind flipped through possibilities. A wild animal, a trick of the light, some person wearing a heavy coat. But that breathing hadn't sounded human or animal in a normal sense. It had a rumbling undercurrent that I felt in my gut. I decided I needed to move away from this spot. My tent didn't seem safe. I walked back to it anyway, grabbed my backpack, and shoved some gear into it. My hands shook so much that I dropped a water bottle. The entire time I kept glancing over my shoulder. I listened for that breathing. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath because I realized my batteries were almost done. I rummaged through my pack, pulled out spare batteries and swapped them quickly. Then I turned around and surveyed the clearing again. Everything felt wrong. The horizon had changed. The trees, the boulders, the ground, all of it seemed shifted. The sky wasn't just dark. It had this faint red tint like distant fire. I didn't smell smoke, though. Just that metallic odor mixed with dust. I took a deep breath and started walking down what I hoped was the original trail. My boots crunched on the dust, and I heard each step echo in a strange way. The air stayed still. No wind brushed my face. No birds called out. My breath sounded loud. Every little noise I made felt amplified. I walked for about 15 minutes checking for trail markers, but I couldn't find any. The path looked different, like someone had replaced it with new terrain. Rocks jutted out at odd angles. The trees formed a strange pattern, almost a grid, but I tried not to think about that. I just kept walking, scanning for a sign of anything familiar. I started to worry that maybe I was hallucinating. I checked my phone, but it had no signal, and the clock on it just blinked 00. That made no sense. The battery icon showed half charge, yet it wouldn't show me the time. I stuffed it back in my pocket. My mouth felt parched, and I realized I needed a drink. I took my water bottle out and drank slowly. The water tasted stale, but I forced it down. My arms felt heavy and my legs hurt from the tension. I knew I needed to stay alert, so I pressed on. After another 20 minutes of walking, I heard that breathing again. This time it came from my left, deeper in the trees. My heart raced and I stopped in my tracks. The sound was softer than before, like it was trying not to be noticed. I killed my flashlight to see if I could spot any movement in the darkness. At first I saw nothing. Then I caught a faint glimmer, like something reflecting the dim red glow in the sky. My stomach lurched, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I couldn't tell if it was the same shape I'd seen or something else. My instincts told me to keep moving, get out of that area. But I also felt a strange pull, like I needed to know what was there. My feet felt like lead. My breaths came in short bursts. I flicked my flashlight back on, aimed it at the spot. The glare was too bright for my eyes, and I squinted. There was nothing but a cluster of trees and undergrowth. The breathing stopped again. I stepped backward, stumbling over a rock. I caught myself from falling, but ended up dropping my flashlight. It bounced on the ground, flickering. I scrambled to pick it up, scraping my hand on a jagged stone. Blood trickled out, and I winced from the sting. I clutched the flashlight and forced myself to keep moving. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. The dust in the air made it harder to breathe. My eyes watered, and I blinked to clear them. I followed what looked like a narrow gap between two tall rock formations. The path wound around, and I tried to remember the layout from my earlier hike. Nothing matched up. This wasn't the same path. I glanced at my surroundings, noticing the way the rocks had smooth, almost polished surfaces. My boots slipped a few times on the dusty ground. Each time I felt my stomach clench. I was sure that thing, or something else, was nearby. Then the breathing came from directly behind me. I spun around and aimed the flashlight. I saw dust swirling in the beam. No shape, no figure, just that rasping breath. It sounded closer. My scalp tingled, and I felt sweat on my forehead despite the cold air. I forced myself to speak, my voice shaky. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I heard my own words echo back, which unsettled me even more. The breathing faded, and I was left with silence again. I started walking faster, almost jogging, ignoring the pain in my legs. The trail dipped downward, and the ground under me felt loose. I slipped and slid a few feet. My flashlight showed a steep incline ahead. I braced myself with my free hand against a rock and caught my breath. The cold air burned my lungs. I thought about turning back, but I had no idea where that would lead me. I decided to keep going forward. I kept walking for another half hour. My watch was frozen at some random time, and my phone was useless, so I guessed the time by how my body felt. Exhaustion weighed on me. My mind was focused on finding any sign of normality, maybe a familiar trail marker, a glimpse of my car, or anything that looked like the campsite. But every corner I turned brought more strange formations and more gray dust. The sky stayed a dull red, giving me just enough light to make out shapes. It felt like I'd stepped into a different world. At one point, I climbed up a rocky ledge to get a better view. I looked out and saw the mountain peaks in the distance. They were oddly shaped, like they had sharp angles that weren't there before. The land between me and those peaks seemed flat, without the usual hills I would expect. In the silence, I heard my own breathing echo. I waited, listening for that other breathing, but it didn't come. For a moment, I just stood there, my legs aching and my throat dry. My chest felt tight and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I finally decided I needed to rest. I found a small indent in the rock face that provided partial shelter. I took off my pack and sat down, shining my flashlight around to make sure I wasn't sitting next to anything that might move. The air felt stale, and there was that metal smell again. I tried to gather my thoughts, but everything spun in my head. I couldn't figure out what had happened. The bright light that blinded me, the sudden change in the landscape, the heavy breathing, none of it made sense. But I knew I couldn't let panic take over completely. I had to keep moving. I had to find a way to get back to the parking area, or at least to a place where my phone might work. I forced myself to eat an energy bar. It tasted like cardboard, but I swallowed it down. The dryness in my mouth made me cough. I squeezed my scraped hand into a fist. The cut stung, and the blood on my palm was dry and flaky. That pain felt real, and it reminded me I was still alive, still in my body, still able to fight my way out of this. After about 10 minutes of rest, I stood up, pulled my backpack on, and gripped the flashlight tight. I pressed forward, heading down a slope that seemed to lead back toward the direction of my original campsite. As I walked, I glanced behind me every few steps. My nerves were on edge. I expected to see that shape following me, but I never did. The breathing had vanished, or at least it wasn't close enough for me to hear. My footfalls echoed on the rocks, and the dust puffed up with each step. My nose burned from the particles in the air. My muscles ached and my mind felt foggy. But I kept going because I had no other choice. Eventually, the path leveled out, and I saw a faint glow ahead. Not the same red glow in the sky. This was more like a pale white light far in the distance. I had no idea what it was, but it gave me some hope. I decided to head toward it. Every now and then I stumbled, cursing under my breath. My legs were close to giving out, but that light kept me moving forward. If it was some sort of exit or a real sign of civilization, I had to reach it. That's how my night went after that flash in the sky. That's what I saw, heard, and felt. I have no big explanation, no clever theories. I just know that the trail I started on wasn't the trail I ended up on, and that heavy breathing still creeps into my nightmares. I never saw a clear figure, never heard a voice, never found a campsite or another person out there. All I could do was push forward toward that distant light, hoping it would lead me back to something familiar. And that's what happened. That's the whole story as I lived it. It's still raw in my mind, and I can't shake the memory of that sudden blinding light and the world that felt like it shifted under my feet. But I'm here to tell it, so that must count for something. That's all I've got. I moved into my new apartment on a Wednesday morning. The place looked normal enough: gray walls, white ceiling, simple kitchen, and a decent view of the city. I was on the 15th floor, which felt both exciting and intimidating. I liked being high up, away from traffic noise, away from the streetlights shining through my windows. I had no idea that same height would turn into a source of unease. I had no idea I would lie awake at night, listening to voices that didn't make sense. Right now, I wish I had never signed that lease. I remember my first night there. I was exhausted from unpacking, so I just threw my mattress on the floor and fell asleep. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up feeling sweaty and a bit cold. The temperature in the bedroom seemed off. I sat up and heard a muffled whisper. I thought it was the ventilation or maybe my new neighbors talking in the hallway. I ignored it and tried to sleep again, but the whisper got louder. I forced myself up, walked to the window, and opened it a bit wider. I heard a low voice, almost like someone telling a story in slow motion. It sounded like it came from outside the window, but I was 15 floors above the ground. It didn't make sense. I shut the window and told myself I was dreaming. My throat felt tight. My heart was racing. I turned on my bedside lamp and looked around. Everything was quiet except for the faint hum of the city. Cars, horns, distant sirens, typical urban noise. Nothing else. I breathed a little easier and went back to bed. I slept with the light on, though. It felt like the only way to calm myself. The next morning, I shrugged it off. I blamed it on the stress of moving. I went to work, came back in the evening, and started arranging the living room. While I was moving boxes, I found an old newspaper wedged in the corner of the floor. It was from a few years ago. It had a headline about a real estate scandal. I didn't think much of it, but I wondered why it was just sitting there. It looked brittle and stained, as if it had been left behind intentionally. I tossed it aside and continued with my setup. That night, I left the window open because the apartment was stuffy. I sat on my couch and watched TV for a while. Around midnight, I heard the same voice. It came from the window, or through the window, or maybe just near it. It was low and sounded distant, but the words felt clear. He used to sit here alone. He never left his room for days. I shut the TV off. My chest tightened. I walked slowly to the window and looked out. The street was far below. The wind felt cold on my skin. My arms broke out in goosebumps. I didn't see anyone on the balconies next door. There was no one on the fire escapes. I was alone, but I still heard that voice. It continued in a hushed tone. He wrote everything in a journal. Then it stopped. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel my own pulse. I closed the window in a panic and backed away. My legs felt weak. I realized my hands were shaking. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the building had some weird echo effect. Maybe there was a vent carrying someone's voice from a few floors below. I considered going down to the front desk to ask the doorman if there were known issues with strange sounds. I decided against it. It was late, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. Instead, I turned up the volume on the TV and tried to ignore the feeling that something was very wrong. Over the next few days, I started to hear more of these whispers at odd times. Sometimes I heard them around 1 a.m., other times at 3 a.m. Once I heard them in the late afternoon, just as the sun was setting. Each time the words were about someone who used to live in the building. The voice mentioned small details. A tenant who locked himself in the bathroom for hours. A woman who never opened her curtains. A man who collected dozens of newspapers and stacked them in his closet. The descriptions sounded random, but they got under my skin. One night, the whisper changed. Instead of telling me about past tenants, it said, "You need to look under the sink. You need to find what's been hidden there." I felt my mouth go dry. My knees felt weak. I waited a moment, hoping it was just another weird statement about the building's history, but the whisper repeated it, more insistent this time. My chest felt tight. I walked toward the kitchen slowly. My palms were sweaty. My stomach felt uneasy. When I opened the cabinet under the sink, I found an old jar covered with dust. Inside it, there were some coins and a small piece of paper. The paper had a scribbled sentence. "Listen to them and do what they say." That made my hands tremble. I set the jar down, took a step back, and stared at it. My head was pounding. I felt a surge of nausea. I asked myself if this was some prank. Maybe someone knew about the weird acoustics in the building and decided to set me up. But I had no idea who would do that. I lived alone. I barely knew any neighbors. This discovery was too strange to ignore. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the voice calling me from the window. It demanded that I check the hallway closet on my floor. It told me to look there for a clue, something about an old piece of furniture left behind. I fought the urge to go out there. I didn't want to wander around the hallway in my pajamas like some kind of lunatic. But the voice wouldn't stop. It hissed and repeated the demand until I felt I had no choice. My body was tense. My hands were clammy. I got dressed and opened my front door slowly. The hallway lights flickered a bit. It was silent except for the hum of the elevator shaft. I walked to the closet at the end of the corridor. It was marked maintenance, but it wasn't locked. Inside, I saw a few shelves with paint cans and cleaning supplies. Then I noticed an old wooden table leaning against the wall. It had scratches on the surface. There was a single drawer. I pulled it open and found a small notebook wrapped in plastic. I unwrapped it. The first page had notes about the building. The handwriting was shaky. It said, "They speak at night, they command, they watch, do not resist." My stomach lurched. I flipped a few pages and saw dates, times, and short descriptions. 2 a.m. asked me to break the mirror. 3 a.m. told me to cut the power. 4 a.m. demanded that I find the hidden jar under the sink. I shut the notebook. I could feel the blood rushing to my head. I stuffed it in my jacket pocket and went back to my apartment. The elevator ride felt like it took forever, even though it was only a few floors. When I got inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. I felt dizzy. I kept thinking, why me? Why this place? Who else heard these voices? Around 2 in the morning, they came back. This time, the whisper was more forceful, like a low growl. It said, "You found the notebook. You know what happens now." I stared at the window. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The voice demanded I pull up the old carpeting in my living room. It said there was a trapdoor underneath. I didn't want to believe it. That carpet looked fairly new, installed maybe a year ago, but I felt compelled to listen. My heart was pounding. My skin felt cold. I moved my coffee table out of the way. I grabbed the edge of the carpet and tugged. It lifted easily. Beneath it, near the corner of the room, I saw a square piece of wood that didn't match the rest of the floor. It had a small metal ring attached. I knelt down. My legs were shaking. I pulled the ring. The wood lifted, revealing a small opening about 1 foot across. Inside, I saw another jar, just like the one under my sink. My breath got stuck in my throat. I could barely breathe. I lifted the jar out. It was empty except for a folded note. I opened it. It said, "There's no turning back." My body shook. I stared into the dark hole for a moment, then closed it and put the carpet back. I felt trapped in some twisted game. For the next few days, the voice demanded little things. It told me to gather old papers, check behind the fridge, unscrew a vent cover, read old documents. I was always sweating, always on edge, always afraid to disobey. When I tried to ignore the voice, it would become louder, repeating the command until I caved in. One evening, I turned up the music on my headphones to block it out. My head started throbbing until I yanked the headphones off, gasping for air. The voice hissed, "Don't fight us." It felt like someone had stabbed me in the head with a needle. I had no choice but to do what it said. I found a box of old items behind the fridge. It contained letters addressed to someone named Martin, dated 8 years earlier. Each letter mentioned strange requests and sleepless nights. The tone of the letters made me think Martin was also hearing voices. He wrote, "I can't stay here, but I can't leave. They follow me everywhere inside this apartment." The letters were covered in smudges, maybe from sweaty hands or spilled coffee. I felt my stomach twist. I realized other people had gone through this. They either left or lost their minds. As the days went on, I became more paranoid. I avoided my neighbors. I spoke little at work. I came home every evening with knots in my shoulders, dreading the next command. Sometimes the voice would stay silent until midnight, and I would pray it stayed that way. But it always came back. One night I decided to confront it. I went to the window as soon as I heard it start. I shouted, "Why are you doing this to me?" My voice echoed in the empty room. I felt my chest tighten. I got no answer. I waited, breathing fast. Then the whisper returned, almost right in my ear. "You're the chosen occupant. Fulfill your role." I jerked around, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. My knees almost gave out. A few nights ago, it told me to go to the basement storage area. I hadn't even known there was a basement for tenants, since it wasn't labeled on the elevator panel. The elevator went down to the ground floor, but there was another button labeled B. I pressed it. My heart was slamming. The ride down felt like an eternity. The basement hallway smelled like damp concrete. My footsteps echoed. I didn't see any staff. It looked more like a tunnel than a proper storage area. Pipes ran along the ceiling. I found a row of locked chain-link storage units. One of them was open. Inside was a single cardboard box on the floor. It had my apartment number scrawled on the side in thick black marker. I approached it, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. I opened the box. I saw an old key, a photograph of a man standing in front of the same window in my apartment, and another folded note. This note read, "He tried to resist. He failed. You must obey." My hands shook. I placed the note back in the box. I left the basement feeling a chill all over my skin. My breath was short and my head felt light. When I got back to my apartment, I put the box in a closet and locked the door. That brings me to now. I sit here in my living room waiting for the next command. It's almost midnight. My curtains are closed, but I know if I open them, I'll hear those voices. They always find a way in through the night air. I haven't told anyone about this because I don't think they'd believe me. My boss asked if I'm feeling okay, said I look pale. I just nodded. I can't begin to explain what's going on. I don't know if I'm going crazy or if these voices are truly real. All I know is that each new discovery leads to more demands, and I'm scared of what might happen if I refuse. I stay away from the window now. I don't want to see whatever is out there. The voice still appears, though. Sometimes it even sounds like it's inside the walls. I jump at every small noise in this apartment. My phone battery is draining faster than usual, probably because I keep pacing around, checking messages, doing anything to distract myself. But no matter how many games I play or how many videos I watch, I can't shake the sensation that I'm being watched. I feel goosebumps on my arms even when the air isn't cold. I think about leaving, but the lease is long, and I can't afford to break it. Besides, I'm not convinced that walking out would solve anything. That old note said whoever tried to resist failed. I don't know what that means. Maybe they had a mental breakdown. Maybe they just left. I have no proof of anything worse. But I feel trapped. My chest tightens every time I think about staying, and my throat closes up when I think about leaving. I'm stuck either way. I don't know how this will end. I just know that every night around the same time I hear that faint whisper. It calls to me by name now. It mentions details about my life that I've never told anyone. The voice is inside my head and in my apartment at the same time. When it speaks, my scalp tingles and my eyes water. My breathing becomes uneven. My hands cramp from how tightly I clench them. I want to say I'm going to fight it, but I don't even know how. Right now, I'm just sitting here waiting. It's almost 1 a.m. I'm trying to stay calm. My palms are sweaty. The air around me feels tense. The building's walls feel thin, like they can't hide anything. My mouth is dry and my heart is pounding. I keep looking at the door, at the window, at the floor, expecting something to happen. I hear a faint whisper now. It's calling my name. It wants something. I can feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My skin prickles and my stomach drops. I know I'll have to answer. I don't know if I'll ever break free of this. Maybe I'll find another clue. Maybe there's another box hidden somewhere with more instructions. But right now, I just sit in the dark, listening, obeying, and wishing I had never found this place. I want to get this off my chest right away. I never believed in strange phenomena or supernatural places. I always thought those stories were just exaggerations or illusions people created when they got scared. But last month, something happened that changed how I see the world around me. Now, whenever I think back on that day, I feel a tightness in my stomach. My palms get clammy, and my breath gets shallow. I can't push it out of my head. It feels like it happened yesterday, even though some weeks have passed. I was on a road trip driving through a region known for its dense forests. I had taken some vacation time, hoping to clear my head and find some peace away from the city noise. After a few hours on the road, I started feeling restless. My eyes were getting heavy, and I felt stiff from sitting so long. I saw a small dirt road off the main highway, cutting into the forest, and I decided to pull over and stretch my legs. My car was the only vehicle around. There weren't any houses, gas stations, or signs of civilization. Just tall, thick trees lining both sides of the road. I turned off the engine, grabbed a bottle of water from the passenger seat, and stepped out. The air smelled damp and fresh. The ground under my shoes felt a bit soft, probably from recent rain. I heard birds in the distance and some rustling, maybe from small animals. Aside from that, it was dead quiet. I followed a narrow path that wound deeper into the forest. I wasn't planning a long walk, but I wanted to explore a little. The trees got denser, and the path felt darker. Sunlight filtered through branches overhead, but most of the trail looked shaded. I kept walking, taking careful steps to avoid tripping over roots. I didn't want to get lost, so I made mental notes of fallen logs and distinct trees. About 10 minutes in, I noticed something strange up ahead. Through a gap in the trees, I saw a clearing. Bright sunlight fell onto a circle of stones. I could see that each stone looked old and weathered, maybe the size of a large chair. They stood upright in a rough ring formation. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared, trying to figure out why someone would place these stones there. I approached the circle slowly. My heart began to race a little, not out of terror, but because it felt unusual. I've seen old rock formations in pictures, but never anything like this in person. They looked rough, covered in patches of moss. The space inside the circle was about the size of a small room, maybe 15 feet across. The grass inside looked slightly overgrown, and I noticed a few fallen branches. There was no sign telling me to keep out, so I stepped over the outer edge of the circle to see it up close. The second my foot touched the ground inside that ring, I felt a mild vibration under my shoes. It was faint, almost like a gentle hum. I thought maybe I was imagining it, so I pressed my soul against the soil, trying to see if it was real. It disappeared. I shrugged it off and walked around the circle. That's when I noticed how quiet everything had become. The birds I'd heard moments before were gone. The rustling in the underbrush stopped. Even the wind seemed to die down. It felt like I'd walked into a vacuum. The silence actually made my ears ring. Then I heard laughter. It was soft at first, like someone giggling far away. I spun around, expecting to see another hiker or maybe a group of campers. Nobody was there. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed a bit. No response. The laughter faded, and I thought I might have just heard something carried on the breeze. I started walking toward the center of the circle. That's when I heard a low singing. It sounded like a group of people chanting, but I couldn't make out any words. It felt like it was coming from all directions, but I still saw no one. My stomach tightened. My breathing got shallow. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple. This made no sense. The sunlight over the clearing started to shift, and the shadows of the stones stretched across the grass in odd angles. I looked up. The sun seemed bright enough, but the light had this strange haze to it. My gut told me to leave. I turned around and walked back to the edge of the circle. I stepped outside the ring of stones and started along the same path I had come from. But after a few minutes of walking, I reached another clearing. My heart pounded. It looked exactly like the one I had just left. The same stones stood in a circle, the same patches of moss, and even the same fallen branch in the center. I could feel my stomach drop. I retraced my steps. I tried to find some marker I recognized. There was no difference. It was the same place. I moved away again, more urgent this time. I didn't run, but I walked fast, trying to stay calm. I noticed my breathing getting louder in my ears. My arms felt shaky. Every tree I passed looked like the one before it. Every few seconds I glanced over my shoulder to see if someone was following me. No one was there. When I saw a second clearing ahead, my chest tightened again. It was the same stone circle. It looked exactly the same. My mind started to race. I could feel panic rising in my throat. I forced myself to stop. My hands were shaking so bad I had to grip a nearby tree trunk to steady myself. The bark felt rough under my palm, and I felt a few pieces flake off. I tried to control my breathing. I wasn't sure if I was lost or if there was some trick going on. I decided to make a mark on one of the trees to keep track of where I'd been. I pulled out a small pocket knife I usually keep for emergencies. I carved a short line into the trunk. Then I moved on, making a point to remember the shape of that cut. I kept my eyes on the path. After a minute or two, I spotted another tree with a fresh cut that looked exactly like mine. The same length, the same depth. I ran my finger along it. The wood was still smooth and fresh. My pulse pounded in my ears. I realized I was going in circles, or the forest was messing with me in some impossible way. The singing started up again. It sounded clearer, like voices dancing on the breeze. Laughter followed it. I couldn't see anyone, though. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself to move. I walked toward the source of the sound. It seemed like it was coming from the circle. When I reached the stones again, the sound got loud, then stopped suddenly. The quiet felt suffocating. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. I tried yelling. I shouted, "Who's there? Stop messing with me." My voice sounded small among the trees. No answer. I paced around the circle, looking for any breaks in the line of stones. They were spaced out enough for me to walk between them, but every time I tried to go through, I ended up back in the same clearing. It felt like some invisible boundary was forcing me to loop around. I started to panic. My throat felt tight, and I tasted a metallic tang in my mouth, probably adrenaline. After what felt like hours, I sat on one of the stones. I looked at the dirt. I tried to think of a different approach. I took my water bottle out and sipped. My hands were shaking and I almost spilled it. I can't describe how disorienting it was without using fancy language. It was just raw fear and confusion. I felt trapped. Nothing made sense. The normal rules of walking in one direction and ending up somewhere else didn't apply. I stood up again and decided to follow the edge of the clearing. If the circle was the problem, maybe staying out of its center would help. I walked carefully along the boundary. The ground felt uneven and I tripped on some roots. My ankle rolled and I let out a groan. It hurt, but not bad enough to stop me. After a few minutes, I noticed I was near the same spot. I recognized a knot in one of the stones. I was back where I started. I tried circling the perimeter twice more, each time trying to focus on the direction, but it always brought me back. I gave up on that plan and headed into the woods again, looking for any sign of sunlight that might lead me out. The forest kept twisting. I'd see the same broken log or the same cluster of ferns. When I checked the sky, it looked like the sun hadn't moved at all. Time felt stuck. That's when I heard footsteps. They were light, shuffling somewhere behind me. I spun around, scanning the trees. Nothing. The laughter came again, closer than before. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. I shouted, "Show yourself." Silence. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I could feel sweat dripping down my forehead. My breaths were coming in sharp gulps. I started jogging, ignoring the pain in my ankle. The faster I moved, the more the voices seemed to follow. They didn't feel hostile. They just sounded playful in a twisted way. I wanted to get away from that laughter. It gave me chills. After a while, I slowed down, completely out of breath. My chest burned, my shirt stuck to me, and my legs felt like lead. Suddenly, the laughter stopped and the singing returned. It was a strange tune with a steady rhythm, but I couldn't pinpoint the language. It echoed off the trees. I stumbled forward and found myself at the circle again. I cursed under my breath, feeling tears of frustration welling up. I wiped them away quickly. I just wanted to leave. I wanted my car, my normal life. But I was stuck. I decided to try something different. I picked up a stick and placed it on the ground in front of the stone circle. Then I turned around and walked into the forest, counting each step. I reached 100 steps, then 200. Then I circled back. When I came back to the clearing, the stick was gone. I looked around, but it wasn't anywhere. The stones looked unchanged. My skin prickled. I felt like I was being watched. I thought about staying in one place until sunset, hoping the night sky might guide me out. But when I checked my phone for the time, there was no signal, and the clock showed the same time I started my walk. It wasn't moving. The battery indicator hadn't changed. It felt like time wasn't passing at all. In a surge of desperation, I grabbed one of the stones and tried to push it. It wouldn't budge. I kicked it in frustration. Pain shot through my foot. I dropped to my knees, groaning. Sweat poured off me. I stared at the ground, trying to calm my breathing. That's when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were right behind me. I jerked around, expecting to see someone. No one was there. I stood up, leg throbbing, and glared at the circle. I wanted to scream. I felt lightheaded from the stress. My lips were dry and the water in my bottle was almost gone. I drank what was left. It did little to calm me. I realized I had to figure out a way to break whatever was happening. I tried talking out loud, stating my name, explaining I meant no harm. I said, "I just want to leave. I don't want any trouble." The forest swallowed my words. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard a rustling in the bushes. I froze, expecting an animal or a person. It stopped. My heart hammered in my chest. I took a slow step forward. As soon as I got close, the rustling started again, moving deeper into the woods. I followed it, thinking maybe it was leading me somewhere. I walked until I saw a faint glow ahead. My pulse quickened. Light could mean an exit, or at least a different area. I stepped through some thick shrubs, trying not to scratch my arms too badly. When I emerged, I found myself back at the circle. The glow was just the sunlight hitting the stones at a weird angle. I almost screamed in frustration. My throat felt raw. I sat down on the ground, ignoring the dirt staining my pants. I stared at the trees, feeling beaten. The chanting echoed around me again, that same odd tune. My body trembled. My thoughts were frantic, but I tried to focus on small details to keep from losing it. I looked at my hands, dirty and cut from branches. I felt my chest rising and falling with short, panicked breaths. I told myself to breathe slower. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. It helped a bit. Then a sudden breeze swept through the clearing, carrying the laughter again. It sounded higher in pitch this time, almost right next to my ear. I jolted up, spinning around. My vision blurred for a second. When it cleared, the circle looked different. The stones seemed closer together, like they had moved. I rubbed my eyes. The chanting grew louder, circling my head. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. It felt like it was inside my skull. I dropped to my knees. My heart thumped wildly. Sweat dripped onto the grass. I tried to focus on one idea. There had to be a way out. I pulled out my phone again, desperate for a signal. Nothing. The battery symbol was frozen, just like time. I felt a surge of anger. I slammed my phone on the ground. It didn't crack, just bounced. No logic made sense here. I forced myself to stand, knees shaky. I walked up to the stones and ran my fingers across the moss. It felt cold and damp. I whispered, "Let me go," even though I didn't know who I was talking to. I walked through the gap between two stones, careful to keep my eyes on a thick oak I saw in the distance. I told myself I wouldn't look back. I counted each step again. My ankle hurt, but I ignored it. I reached the oak and placed my hand on its trunk. It felt real. I exhaled slowly and glanced over my shoulder. The circle was still behind me. I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. The laughter and chanting died down. I moved from tree to tree, always keeping the circle behind me. After several minutes, I realized I wasn't hearing those voices anymore. I spotted a small slope in the terrain. I climbed it, pushing away branches. My shirt got caught on some thorns, but I pulled free. At the top, I looked down. Instead of the circle, I saw a faint outline of the road. It looked like a patch of gray through the trees. My heart leapt. I hurried down the slope, ignoring the scratches on my arms. When I broke through the last line of trees, I saw my car in the distance. Relief poured over me. I ran to it, almost laughing with disbelief. My hands fumbled for the keys in my pocket. I threw myself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and tore out of there, kicking up dust and gravel. I didn't stop until I reached a larger highway, where I finally pulled over to catch my breath. I glanced at the clock on my car's dashboard. It said only 40 minutes had passed since I first stopped, even though it felt like I'd been in that forest half the day. My phone showed the same time, frozen, but as soon as I drove away, it started updating again, and the signal bars popped up. I had dozens of missed notifications. My phone's clock jumped forward by several hours in the blink of an eye. Even now, I can't explain what happened in that forest. I don't have the energy to speculate. I just know I was stuck in that circle, hearing laughter and voices, unable to leave no matter what I tried. And then suddenly it let me go, or I found a way out. I'm not sure which is correct, but I'm not going back to find out. I can still feel my heart pounding when I remember the silence and those shifting stones. I'm just relieved to be out, and I hope no one else stumbles on that place. If they do, I doubt they'll forget the feeling of being trapped in that loop. It's not something you can ever shake off once you've felt it. I still remember the first night I heard it. I was sitting in my living room, half asleep on the couch, when a faint melody drifted through the air. It was so soft that I thought I imagined it. But then it grew a little louder. I sat up, thinking I forgot to turn off the TV or the radio, but everything was off. The melody faded, leaving me confused and alert. I walked around the living room, checking every device, but there was no source. I shrugged it off and went to bed, assuming I was just tired. The next morning, I woke up thinking about that melody. I tried to recall the notes, but they slipped away as soon as I focused on them. I felt a slight headache forming behind my eyes whenever I strained to remember. I brushed it off and got ready for work. I told myself it was probably just a dream. My day went by without incident. I work as a receptionist in a small law office. My shift was calm, with routine phone calls and polite greetings. By the time I drove home, I had forgotten about the strange music. That second night, I sat in the kitchen after dinner. I cleaned some dishes, set them on a drying rack, then dried my hands on a dish towel. As soon as I turned around, I heard it again. The same melody, more distinct this time. It floated through the kitchen, sounding close yet impossible to locate. My heart pounded in my chest. I moved from the kitchen to the hallway, trying to find the source, but it always seemed to come from just beyond where I stood. When I stood still, it seemed to circle behind me. I felt a chill crawl up my back. I kept walking from room to room, flipping on lights, checking corners. The melody never stopped until I walked into the living room again. Then it vanished. I stood there, breathing fast, ears strained, but heard nothing. I tried to record the melody in my phone's voice app, but I was too late. It was gone. I'm an amateur musician. I picked up the guitar about 5 years ago. I love music, even though I'm not that good. I don't write my own songs. Mostly I just play covers in my bedroom. Sometimes I invite friends over and we jam on old rock tunes. That night after the melody disappeared, I picked up my guitar. I tried to recreate what I'd heard. I strummed a few chords, tested some finger-picking patterns. None of it sounded right. I tried a slow progression, focusing on the notes I remembered, but they wouldn't form a coherent sequence. My hands shook with frustration. I've learned a lot of songs just by ear, but this tune felt slippery, like it was on the edge of my hearing. Eventually, I gave up and went to bed feeling unsettled. Over the next few days, I carried on with normal life. I went to work, chatted with coworkers, ate lunch at my desk, and tried to ignore the sense of anticipation in my stomach. At home, I felt on edge. Every quiet moment felt charged. When I sat alone in my bedroom, I noticed how silent the house was. I turned on music or the TV just to break the tension. I told myself I was acting weird and paranoid. But every time I let the house grow quiet, that melody returned. I couldn't shake it. One night I decided to stay quiet on purpose just to confirm I wasn't imagining things. I sat on the edge of my bed, lights off, no TV, no phone. A deep hush fell over the room. I breathed slowly, listening. My ears felt sensitive, like they were waiting for something. Then, slowly, that strange tune slid into my awareness. It sounded far away at first, like it was coming from beneath the floor or behind the walls. My heart started to pound. A wave of heat spread across my chest. I sat completely still, and the melody got louder. It had a steady flow with a pattern that rose and fell. My hands trembled against my thighs. I realized I was sweating. I felt my t-shirt clinging to my skin. The melody wrapped around my mind, making me dizzy. I reached over and flicked on the light. The melody cut off right away. I didn't sleep well after that. My mind replayed the notes over and over, in the spots I thought I could recall. In the morning, I forced myself to grab my guitar. I tried to hammer out the tune before work. I pressed the strings, picked a few notes, and paused to adjust my fingering. I thought I had part of it for a moment, but then I lost track. I could feel my chest tighten with annoyance. I was already running late, so I gave up and sprinted out the door. That evening, the melody attacked me again the moment I walked inside. It wasn't just a faint tune anymore. It had a pull, like it demanded my attention. I dropped my bag on the floor and hurried to my guitar. I sat down on the living room couch, placed the guitar on my lap, and started searching for the notes. My fingertips pressed the strings, moving up and down the fretboard. Each time I got close, I felt a small rush in my gut, almost like excitement. Then I would lose the thread, and my body would tense with frustration. Eventually, I managed to piece together a rough version of that melody. It sounded shaky and uneven, but it was close. The moment I started playing it, I felt my heart hammer in my chest. My pulse throbbed in my ears. My breathing turned shallow. I played the same sequence again, trying to smooth it out. My wrists started to ache. My eyes watered from not blinking. I played it again. I felt sweat run down my back. My throat went dry, but I kept going. I couldn't stop. My mind focused on each note. My fingers stung from pressing the strings, but I pushed through the pain. After maybe an hour, I realized my shirt was soaked in sweat. My arms trembled every time I lifted them. My muscles felt weak, and my head ached. I stood up, shaking, and walked to the kitchen to drink some water. My entire body buzzed with tension. My ears rang. After I guzzled 2 glasses of water, I leaned against the counter, panting. I could still hear the melody in my head, but it felt calmer. I went to bed early, feeling sore, like I had exercised for hours. The next few days repeated that cycle. I'd come home from work and the melody would seize me. I'd grab my guitar without even thinking about it. I'd play until my fingers burned and my shoulders cramped. Sometimes I'd snap out of it, look at the clock, and realize hours had passed. I'd feel disoriented, dizzy, and drained. My legs would shake when I tried to stand. My heart would pound. The ringing in my ears never left. Sleep became more difficult because my arms twitched at night. I'd wake up feeling exhausted. My coworkers told me I looked pale. I started avoiding social invites. I just wanted to get through my day and rush home to this bizarre routine. One Saturday, I decided enough was enough. I didn't want to be home alone. I called a friend and asked him to come over and jam. He showed up in the afternoon. We set up in my living room, plugging in amps and tuning our guitars. I noticed the house felt quiet. I didn't hear the melody at all. I actually felt relief. My friend asked if I was okay because I looked tired. I told him I was just stressed from work. We played a few rock songs, we chatted about random stuff. I laughed for the first time in days. The melody stayed away as long as my friend was in the house. After a couple of hours, my friend had to leave. The moment he walked out, I felt a strange pressure in the air. The melody slipped back into my hearing like it had been waiting. It sounded more intense, and I felt a wave of heat spread through my chest. I went straight to my guitar, even though I wanted to ignore it. My muscles felt tense. I started to play. My fingers moved on autopilot. I barely thought about the notes. The melody poured out in a continuous loop. My hands cramped. My shoulders hurt. My wrists popped every time I shifted position. Sweat dripped into my eyes. I blinked, but I didn't stop. My breaths came in gasps, and my throat felt sore. My cheeks burned. I could feel my pulse pounding. Eventually, I collapsed against the back of the couch. My guitar slipped off my lap and clattered onto the carpet. The ringing in my ears intensified, and everything went black for a second. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was lying sideways, breathing hard. My vision blurred around the edges. My hands still twitched with the shapes of the chords. I crawled to the bathroom, feeling dizzy and nauseous. I splashed cold water on my face. The reflection in the mirror showed bloodshot eyes and pale skin. My hair stuck to my forehead. I felt my heartbeat in my neck. I had never pushed myself that hard playing guitar. I realized I was shaking from fatigue. My arms tingled. My legs were stiff. I stuck my face under the faucet, letting the water run into my mouth. I swallowed in large gulps, feeling relief on my dry throat. I just stood there, water dripping down my chin, trying to catch my breath. I decided to sleep in a hotel that night. I packed a small bag, grabbed my wallet and keys, and left. Driving felt strange. My arms trembled against the steering wheel. My eyes struggled to focus on the road. I kept hearing the melody in the back of my head like an earworm that refused to leave. At the hotel, I checked in without looking at the receptionist. I just signed the papers and took the room key. Once I was in the room, I sat on the bed staring at the wall. The silence felt unnatural. I waited for the melody to start, but it never came. I almost laughed with relief. I took a hot shower, then I lay on the bed, playing with my phone until I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling rested for the first time in weeks. My body still ached, but my mind felt clear. I looked at my phone, scrolled through emails, and got dressed. For a moment, I thought about staying at the hotel another night, but my budget wasn't great. I also worried about leaving my house unattended. Around noon, I checked out and drove home, telling myself maybe the spell had broken. The moment I stepped inside my house, that familiar heaviness returned. I set my bag on the floor, listening. The melody came back, slow and deliberate. My heart started racing again. I bit down on my lower lip, trying to push away the urge to pick up my guitar. My hands twitched. I pressed them against my thighs and closed my eyes. I felt my pulse throbbing in my temples. Sweat beaded on my forehead, even though the room felt cool. I forced myself to walk into the kitchen. I opened the fridge and stared inside, looking for something to distract me. My vision blurred with anxiety. The melody grew louder. I clenched my fists. My nails dug into my palms, but I barely felt it. Finally, I lost control and sprinted to the living room. I snatched my guitar from its stand and dropped into the chair. My hands shook, but they found the right frets. The tune spilled out of me. I didn't even think about how my body felt. I just played. My breath caught in my chest. My fingertips were raw from pressing the strings day after day. The metal cut into my skin, but I couldn't stop. My arms burned from tension. My shoulders felt cramped. After a while, I realized tears were streaming down my face. I kept playing. My nails rasped against the fretboard. The tune circled around and around, no end in sight. My lungs hurt from shallow breathing. My heartbeat pounded like a hammer. My stomach twisted into knots. I felt like I was trapped. Sweat dripped down my arms onto the guitar body. My back ached from leaning forward. My head pounded. When I finally stopped, I couldn't feel my fingers. They were numb and covered in red marks. My face was hot, and my throat burned. I set the guitar aside and stumbled to my bathroom. I vomited into the toilet, coughing and gagging. My whole body was shaking. I leaned over the sink and splashed water on my face, panting. My limbs felt weak. My mouth tasted sour. I turned on the shower and let the hot water run until the mirror fogged up. I stripped off my sweaty clothes and stepped under the stream. The water pounded on my neck and shoulders. It hurt, but it also felt good. My mind was blank except for the lingering echo of that melody. It looped in my thoughts, never fully leaving. Afterward, I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. My guitar was on the floor. I stared at it, my body numb with exhaustion. My breath came in ragged bursts and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I had no idea what to do. Every time I came home alone, this melody would force me to play until I was near collapse. I felt scared. I felt cornered. But I was too tired to stand. I stayed there, staring at the guitar, thinking about how to survive the next day. I wondered if I should leave the house for good. I wondered if I should destroy my guitar. But I couldn't bring myself to do anything. I just sat in silence, my heartbeat slowing down, waiting for the next wave to hit.